Chapter 2551. Intermediate Cities Effects. The crowd began to converse as they stared at the transformed Stone Forest city. However, Zero Wings members were more shocked than anyone. The moment the seal on the city had lifted, Zero Wings members had been allowed back in. As they entered the city, they were mesmerized. Aside from the city's mana density, which players could feel from outside of it, these players were stunned by the city's new infrastructure. Not only did the buildings look completely different, but quite a few were now shops, run by non-human NPCs. These shops sold special magic scrolls, potions, food, and drinks that were usually very scarce on the market. Most importantly, Stone Forest City now had NPC trading firms shops. These new shops might look like the ones ordinary NPCs owned, but NPC trading firms often issued quests for players. Once players had earned enough reputation points with a particular NPC trading firm, they could receive special, high-ranked quests that offered bountiful rewards. And if they were lucky, they could even obtain high-quality weapons and equipment by completing these quests. These NPC trading firms were one of the main reasons that even now, independent and guild players frequently visited NPC cities. Now that Stone Forest City had some of these trading firm shops as well, they could continue to earn reputation points and pick up quests, saving them the trouble of returning to an NPC city. What did you do, guild leader? Is this really Stone Forest City? Gentle Snow asked, her heart pounding as she gazed around the main street. Stone Forest City now had just as many high-rise buildings and advanced shops as White River City. Truthfully, she would have assumed that she had entered a major NPC city, if not for the eye-catching Freedom Hotel. The biggest difference between NPC and guild cities was the presence of these NPC trading firms. They were responsible for nearly half of the quests available in NPC cities. These quests granted abundant EXP, but they also offered high monetary rewards. Even for expert players, these quests were a main source of income. This was why players were still tied to NPC cities. If they ignored these quests, they'd lose half of their income, and that would make it difficult for ordinary players to survive in God's domain. The chances of acquiring rare materials and equipment in level 100 maps were incredibly low. After all, at this point, ordinary players only grinded for EXP in level 100 maps. They didn't rely on these areas as a stable source of income. Now that Stone Forest City was home to so many NPC trading firms' advanced shops, the resident players wouldn't have to return to an NPC city to pick up or turn in the trading firm's quests. They could simply do so in Stone Forest City. This additional feature would only be a minor convenience for ordinary players, but for the various powers, this would allow them to shake off the shackles that bound them to NPC cities. If other powers had this feature in their guild cities, they would be able to thrive independently, even without the help of NPC cities. They could develop wherever they wished. Of course, this is Stone Forest City. Once a guild city reaches intermediate rank, it gains the ability to survive independently in the fields, Shifeng said, smiling at Gentle Snow's ecstatic expression. There might only be one rank between a basic city and an intermediate city, but it was like the difference between heaven and earth. This was why he had been so eager to upgrade Stone Forest City to intermediate rank. As an intermediate city, Stone Forest City could thrive perfectly well, even if Zero Wing lost Starmoon Kingdom. At this stage of the game, the competition in NPC cities had grown intense, and they were no longer under player control. As a result, managing NPC cities had become incredibly troublesome, and there was a risk of other powers taking over. In contrast, players had full control over guild cities. If other powers wanted to take one over, they'd have to capture it. However, Shifeng considered the Freedom Hotel's completion as far more important than Stone Forest City's promotion. The hotel would be the key that would lead a guild city to prosperity. Not only was the Freedom Hotel's mana incredibly dense, but players could also set up teleportation arrays within. Unlike NPC cities, there were no return scrolls for guild cities, and gaining them was a major challenge. Freedom Hotels, however, could meet that challenge. Any of the Freedom Hotel's guests could purchase return scrolls and teleport to it at any time and from anywhere. This feature was immensely convenient for players that didn't have a residence or house within the city. Aside from the convenience it offered combat players, The Freedom Hotel would be significantly helpful to lifestyle players. Not only would players accumulate the double EXP buff when resting in the hotel, but they would also earn the double lifestyle proficiency buff. Unfortunately, they couldn't accumulate the proficiency buff quite as fast as the double EXP, but it was a precious bonus to lifestyle players. Tools and potions that increased one's lifestyle proficiency acquisition rate were still insanely expensive on the market, far out of ordinary players' budgets. Guild leader, our members are in place. Should we open Stone Forest City now? Gentle Snow reported once she had calmed down. To cope with the Dark World's invasion, they had dispatched a large fraction of the guild's manpower to Stone Forest City. Even though the city was now much larger, they could still manage it without issues. Moreover, Gentle Snow was eager to show the city off to the public. Once Stone Forest City reopened, independent experts would likely have a hard time sitting still. They might even decide to join Zero Wing after discovering the city's changes. Zero Wing was now the only guild to break free from NPC kingdoms and empires. And with the city's help, the guild's members could level up far faster than other players. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Let's wait. We can open the city once I'm done with the Freedom Hotel, Shifeng said. The Freedom Hotel? Gentle Snow was a little confused. The hotel had already been constructed. What more needed to be done? Shifeng didn't explain, however, and instructed her to refine Stone Forest City's management and entrance fee collection. He then headed to the nearby Freedom Hotel. Once he stood in the hotel's inner courtyard, which he had built personally, Shifeng retrieved the ancient Tree of Life's sapling from his bag. The mana density here should be the highest within the city. If not even this is enough, I'll be out of options. Chapter 2552, Fragmented Divine Artifacts effects. As Shifeng exposed the Tree of Life's sapling to the air in the quiet courtyard, the mana in the area rampaged, frantically gathering around the sapling. After a moment, Shifeng felt a pulse of life from the sapling, and its aura grew powerful enough to be visible. The surrounding plants began to grow with astonishing speed as the green energy reached them. Success! Shifeng released a held breath as he watched the sapling's reaction. If this courtyard's mana hadn't been dense enough to accommodate the sapling, he would have had no choice but to give up on it and try to nurture the young tree after promoting Stone Forest City into a main city. However, upgrading a guild city to that rank was incredibly difficult. Not only did the ruling guild need to be powerful enough, but it would also need a lot of time to develop its city. Carefully, Shifeng planted the sapling in the center of the courtyard. He had designed the courtyard and specifically reserved a plot of land in its center for the Tree of Life. To be precise, he had designed a small island in the center of a lake within the courtyard. Not only had he engraved a mana-gathering magic array into the lake bed, but he had also embedded plenty of mana stones into the soil. As a result, the lake water brimmed with mana. Overall, the lake alone had a daily upkeep of nearly 200 mana stones. The various superpowers of his past had considered this the standard configuration for growing a Tree of Life. The necessary mana stones required to maintain the Tree of Life alone would have been more than enough to give current first-rate guilds a heart attack. Ordinary powers simply couldn't afford to play with Trees of Life. Fortunately, he had the Philosopher's Hand. After Shifeng planted the sapling, the air in the courtyard seemed to vibrate. The tranquil, cool atmosphere became scorchingly hot for a time. It even got to Shifeng. After about 3 seconds, the sapling shot up into a large, emerald tree. Its trunk was so thick that it would require 3 fully grown men to just barely be able to wrap their arms around it. The instant the tree reached maturity, dense life aura spread throughout the inner courtyard, tinting everything with a faint shade of green. The high temperature also began to fall to a pleasant warmth. Shifeng felt as if he were standing in the middle of a field on a warm, sunny day. Is this an effect of a fragmented divine artifact? Shifeng wondered, astonished, as he felt the transformations to the inner courtyard. Just planting the Tree of Life had filled the courtyard with life energy, and it was incredibly dense. Bathing in the aura, Shifeng could sense the foreign energy within him rapidly disappear, and his mind felt unusually refreshed. This sensation wasn't like the calm indifference players experienced when around highly dense mana. Rather, Shifeng's mind felt pure and rejuvenated. It was as if all of his thoughts had been given clear, distinct paths, and he knew exactly what to do. If players could practice combat techniques here, they would have a much easier time learning them. Players needed a clear understanding of the techniques to practice and better execute them. After all, it's a pity that I can't let just anyone enter this courtyard. Shifeng gave the Tree of Life a bitter smile. The Tree of Life had already taken root, and any player could discover the tree's identity with an ordinary identification skill. If news got out that Stone Forest City housed a fragmented divine artifact ranked Tree of Life, not even NPC powers would leave Zero Wing in peace, much less players. Everyone would do everything in their power to steal it. Even so, Shifeng was very satisfied with this outcome. The Tree of Life's bonus effects weren't his goal, but the items it would produce. He urgently needed both the Water of Life and the Nuclei of Life. The tree would also produce the Fruits of Life, which were godly tools for NPCs and players' development. Now he just needed to wait for the Tree of Life to produce these items. With the matter of the Tree of Life resolved, Shifeng contacted Gentle Snow to ask, "Snow, how are the arrangements on your side coming along?" "Everyone's in position. After our discussion, we've set the entrance fee to 20 silver. Any player capable of exploring level 100 neutral maps is an expert, so they should be able to afford that price," Gentle Snow said. Even at 10 silver per person, Stone Forest City's player population had maxed out. Now that Stone Forest City was an intermediate city, not only had the mana density within its walls increased, but NPC trading firms' shops were also available. Hence, Gentle Snow and her subordinates had agreed that even if they doubled the entrance fee, Stone Forest City's player population might still skyrocket. The quests the NPC trading firms offered provided a significant portion of players' income, which was why so many experts insisted on keeping their base of operations in NPC cities. 20 silver? You guys are vicious. Shifeng was a little surprised to hear the new entrance fee. Moreover, based on the woman's expression, she must still consider the price a little low. Revealing a bitter smile, Shifeng continued, "That seems fair, but we are trying to develop Zero Wing as quickly as possible. And to do that, we'll need to attract as many experts to the city as we can. Normally, expert players have their own private teams, which include players of low standards. If those players cannot survive in Stone Forest City, their expert friends will go elsewhere." Stone Forest City was much larger than it had been, and it would even have plenty of room to spare if 7 or 8 million players visited. They no longer had to limit access to experts to develop the city. The more players within the city, the more prosperous it would become. In turn, more NPCs would visit, particularly those of other races. Furthermore, money was no longer a problem for the guild now that Zero Wing was capable of intercontinental travel. Rather than focus on money, they should try to grow Zero Wing's strength. Zero Wing wasn't nurturing as many Tier 3 players as it had been, and if they wished to attract more within a short time, they'd have to recruit more expert players. In that case, should we stick with 10 silver? Gentle Snow asked. After listening, she agreed with Shifeng's reasoning. Most of the city's previous visitors had been experts from the various guilds and members of powerful adventurer teams. Independent experts only made up a small minority of Stone Forest City's player population. However, she hadn't paid much attention to the matter since Stone Forest City had only been able to accommodate so many players. Now that mainstream players had reached level 100, it would be unwise to increase the city's entrance fee too much as they needed to recruit more players into Zero Wing and nurture more Tier 3 experts. No. Lower it to the minimum 5 silver, Shifeng decided. F5. Gentle Snow stuttered, stunned. Stone Forest City was now an intermediate city. Maintaining the original entrance fee would already be a major concession. She didn't even want to imagine what would become of the city if they lowered the entrance fee to 5 silver. Just set it to 5 silver, Shifeng said, nodding. It's about time we make some changes in Zero Wing. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Shifeng then instructed Gentle Snow to open the city to the public after adjusting the entrance fee. Meanwhile, the numerous independent and guild players outside of the city were growing impatient. They all shared their guesses about Stone Forest City's abrupt promotion. Is Zero Wing really going to make us wait outside for an entire day? I doubt it. There's too many of us out here. The entrance fees alone will be more than enough to make any power jealous. How could Zero Wing possibly pass on so much money? Huh. Look. Stone Forest City is open. Chapter 2553. Shocking Stone Forest City in Cold Spring Forest's inner area. A 100-man team of superbly equipped, level 107 plus experts ate up the ground as it followed the forested path toward Stone Forest City. The weakest of the team's mounts was secret silver rank, and as the team boldly flew down the small path, all players in their way stepped aside, none daring to hinder the team's advance. Even the various major powers members moved aside. Players didn't just move out of the expert team's way because of their imposing auras, but because of the guild emblem these players wore. It was Crimson Emperor's emblem, and not even God's domain's major powers could afford to offend the guild. Remember what the Grand Elders told you, illusory. You are not to act unnecessarily once we're in Stone Forest City. The fierce man riding a six-clawed war bear and leading Crimson Emperor's main force warned illusory words, who had been silent during their entire journey. Although he didn't know what made her think Zero Wing could stop Demon's Heart's assault, the guild's word was law. If illusory words leaked any information to Zero Wing, and the various powers or Demon's Heart discovered it, she would put their guild in a very awkward position. I at least have that much common sense. I'm only going to take a look. You don't need to worry, illusory words said, chuckling. Personally, she didn't think Zero Wing stood much of a chance against the various superpowers and Demon's Heart. She only thought the guild wouldn't go down so easily. She simply wanted to visit Stone Forest City to verify her assumption. When the two fell silent, a tall, beautiful female swordsman with short hair rode forward and matched paces with illusory words' mount. Unlike the other experts on the team, she wasn't wearing Crimson Emperor's guild emblem. Are you sure it's all right to take us with you, Vice Guild Leader Illusory? The short-haired woman asked. If Sherfeng were present, he'd be quite surprised. This short-haired swordsman was none other than Graceful Monarch from the Dark Den's Extreme Light Shelter. Relax. We're just going to take a look. We're not conducting some secret operation. Now that the Extreme Light Shelter and Crimson Emperor are allies, it's only a matter of time before you'll start developing on the main continent. It's best that you view the situation with your own eyes. Cold Spring Forest will likely become one of the main battlegrounds between regular players like us and dark players, and there are quite a few superpowers in Stone Forest City right now. Such a grand occasion doesn't happen every day. Illusory words said, smiling. I can rest easy then, Graceful Monarch said, nodding and breathing a sigh of relief. By now, she understood how insignificant the Dark Den was in God's domain, and after witnessing Crimson Emperor's residence, she realized what it meant to be a true superpower. Purple Rakshas's description of superpowers had been an understatement. Before the various superpowers, the Extreme Light Shelter was nothing. It didn't even come close to rivaling first-rate powers. She was already quite fortunate that Crimson Emperor had wanted to ally with the Extreme Light Shelter. Monarch, I told you that Big Sis Illusory is a very nice person. It's all thanks to her that I improved so quickly. Since she's agreed to bring you and your team along on this trip, you'll definitely grow a lot stronger. The other shelter's experts might not even be a problem for you once you return to the Dark Den, Purple Rakshasa whispered, smiling as Graceful Monarch nervously fidgeted even after Illusory Word's reassurance. Our visit to the main continent has certainly been full of surprises. I had never thought the guild Blue Frost belongs to would be so powerful. Not only did Zero Wing slay troubled times, but it has also forced Demon's Heart to use its trump card, Graceful Monarch whispered back. She didn't know exactly how formidable Zero Wing was, but the fact that the guild had accomplished such feats meant that Shelter 1 wouldn't have to worry about its future. Zero Wing is indeed amazing, but it is only a pseudo-superpower right now. It still doesn't compare to Crimson Emperor. Since the Extreme Light Shelter and Crimson Emperor have entered a partnership, you won't have to worry about the shelter's development, Purple Rakshasa said. She knew what her companion was thinking. Chuckling, she continued, Zero Wing is about to face every player in a major otherworld. Even if it isn't annihilated, those players will at least partially cripple the guild. Shelter One's development will likely become a problem. With the threat of destruction looming over Stone Forest City, Zero Wing wouldn't likely be able to help Shelter One in the future. In contrast, the Extreme Light Shelter had Crimson Emperor's help. Becoming one of the Dark Den's top 3 shelters should be entirely possible. While Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa continued their conversation in whispered tones, the team left the forest that surrounded Stone Forest City. Stone Forest City lies ahead. Be careful once you enter the city. Many superpowers have hidden their forces within. If you accidentally offend one of them, we'll have trouble to deal with. Illusory words warn the two from the Dark Den. Zero Wing's main headquarters is ahead of us? Curiosity flashed in Graceful Monarch's eyes. I'll finally get a look at how strong the guild behind Blue Frost is. She still hadn't forgotten the image of Shifeng stopping the Demon King's hand in the Dark Den, and it piqued her not long after Illusory Word's warning. The silhouette of a gigantic city came into view. It was just as splendorous as the major NPC cities in the Ten Saints Empire. The mana density radiating from Stone Forest City was especially noticeable. The team felt as if they were gazing at a mountain of magic crystals, rather than a simple guild city. So this is Zero Wing's guild city? Graceful Monarch was momentarily stupefied when she saw the city that brimmed with mana ahead. She had seen plenty of major NPC cities in the Ten Saints Empire. Although these major NPC cities were spectacular and mighty, they paled in comparison to Stone Forest City, and the Extreme Light Shelter was no more than a grass hut in comparison. Even Illusory Words gaped at the scene. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. This wasn't her first visit to Stone Forest City. She had actually traveled to the city multiple times before, but she had no explanation for the view before her. Not only had Stone Forest City become as large and grand as major NPC cities, but it also emitted waves of dense mana, which players could even feel from several thousand yards away. How was this the Stone Forest City she knew? This was practically a holy city hidden in Cold Spring Forest. Illusory Words also spotted a massive line of players waiting outside of Stone Forest City's main entrance. At a glance, there were easily several 100,000 players waiting to enter the city, and as time passed, the number grew. She even spotted quite a few players selling their spots in line. Moreover, Illusory Words noticed plenty of NPCs in line, even those from other races. Stone Forest City now looked more like a well-established, major NPC city, not a guild city. The fierce man beside her glanced Illusory Words' way and asked, "Did you lead us to the wrong place, Illusory?" Chapter 2554 Zero Wing's Trump Card? With the fierce man's question hanging in the air, the rest of Crimson Emperor's members turned to Illusory Words. The Stone Forest City before them was simply too impressive. It was hard to imagine this was merely an intermediate city. They had been busy within the Ten Saints Empire, so they had only heard about Stone Forest City. This was their first visit. Only Illusory Words, who preferred to wander throughout God's domain, had ever seen the city before. These are the coordinates. This should be Stone Forest City, Illusory Words said, giving the fierce man a bitter smile. The sign above the gate clearly states this is the city we're looking for. This shouldn't be a mistake. In truth, even after seeing the sign, she felt as if she had arrived at the wrong place. This looked nothing like the Stone Forest City she had visited in the past. It almost looked like a major NPC city. Furthermore, there was too much mana wafting from the city. Not even the holy city of Titan had such dense mana. Stone Forest City looked nothing like a player-owned city. Crimson Emperor's members snapped out of their daze and examined the city before them. Just as Illusory Words had said, this was undoubtedly Stone Forest City. Crimson Emperor's members weren't the only players shocked by Stone Forest City's new appearance. Some of the various major powers experts that had come to investigate the upgraded city were just as astonished by what they found. No one had ever thought a guild city would change so drastically when it grew from a basic city to intermediate rank. Black Flame really is amazing. With so much mana in the city, players will still choose to rest here, even with the Dark World's imminent invasion. With the entry fees alone, Zero Wing won't have any financial worries for a while. Galaxy Past, the Star Alliance's guild leader, enviously commented as he gazed in awe at the splendorous city before him. Once upon a time in Starmoon Kingdom, the Star Alliance had stood toe-to-toe with Zero Wing. However, while the Star Alliance had been nursing headaches over its daily income, Zero Wing was swimming in money. Nowadays, the various guilds' main source of income was the entrance fees they collected in their guild towns and cities. But as more towns and cities rose up in neutral maps, the competition between them grew intense. To maintain an edge over their competition, most guild towns and cities had reduced their entrance fees to a painful low. Stone Forest City, on the other hand, wouldn't have such worries. As the sole guild city in a level 100 neutral map, it had no competition whatsoever. It could set whatever entrance fee it wished, and plenty of players would still visit the city. That's for sure. Zero Wing will make a killing. You've just arrived, so you might not realize how insane the guild is. But Zero Wing is only charging 5 silver per person to enter the city. I've heard that it's the lowest price you can set for an intermediate city. Other guild cities in neutral maps charge at least 2 silver per person, but they're nothing compared to Stone Forest City. Many of my friends are planning to shift their base of operations to Stone Forest City, and I'm sure they're not alone in that idea. I suspect we'll see the number of players trying to get an increase by at least 10-fold. An independent Tier 3 shield warrior in front of Galaxy Past in line said, nodding in agreement. 5 silver. Flourishing Willow, the Tier 3 female ranger behind Galaxy Past, stared at the shield warrior with wide, shocked eyes, doubting his claim. First-rate guilds like the Star Alliance had no choice but to reduce their entrance fees due to how much competition they faced, but Stone Forest City was unique. Even if it cost 20 silver to enter the city, a ton of players would still use it as their bases, let alone 10 silver. God's Domain had far too many players and innumerable experts. Stone Forest City wasn't nearly large enough to accommodate so many players. With a guild city's limited capacity, and the fact that Zero Wing wouldn't have to worry about customers, increasing the entrance fee was the wisest decision. Yet Zero Wing had done the opposite. Flourishing Willow simply couldn't believe it. Even Crimson Emperor's members, who had just found a place in line, were astonished when they learned about the city's cheap entrance fee. Charging anything less than 20 silver would be an insult to such a sacred resting ground as Stone Forest City in their opinions. They had even been prepared to pay 30 silver per person to enter the city. Not only would the city's incredibly dense mana help players rapidly recover from exhaustion, but players would also see astounding results if they trained within the city. 30 silver was more than worth such benefits for experts like them. So what was the point of lowering the entrance fee to 5 silver? So this is Black Flame's trump card. It certainly is a wise move, the fierce man from Crimson Emperor muttered, overhearing the Star Alliance's conversations. Had Zero Wing set Stone Forest City's entrance fee at 20 or 30 silver per person, there wouldn't be as many players interested in living in the city. Although the city would eventually become overcrowded, it would take some time. Not all players could afford such a high price after all. In contrast, even ordinary level 100+ players could afford 5 silver, and they made up the majority of God's Domain's player base. With such a low entrance fee, the city's player population would reach its limit in 2 or 3 days. Even at 5 silver per person, the city would generate amazing profits. This is going to give Demon's Heart's Flaming Light a huge headache. Zero Wing can easily earn over 1 million gold in the next 2 or 3 days. Including the profits it earns from the businesses within the city, the guild will earn a minimum of 2 million gold before 3 days pass. With so much money, Zero Wing can easily survive the Dark World's assault for a very long time. Illusory Words said, smiling. Even after seeing the city's glorious transformation, she hadn't thought highly of Zero Wing's chances, but after this discovery, she recognized that the guild had exceeded her expectations. Now Demon's Heart would have a much harder time threatening Zero Wing. Zero Wing has indeed made a smart move. Unfortunately, it is too late, the fierce man said, shaking his head. What do you mean? Illusory Words asked strangely. I didn't tell you this earlier, but the Grand Elders have secured detailed information regarding Demon's Heart's movements. The Dark World's portal will activate tomorrow at the latest, and the Dark World's various powers and independent experts will surge into Cold Spring Forest, the fierce man said in a whisper to Illusory Words. Zero Wing simply doesn't have enough time to collect the wealth it requires. Stone Forest City was quite attractive, especially to ordinary players, but it would take time for ordinary players to learn of the city's perks. Moreover, ordinary players didn't travel via teleportation like experts. They generally moved between countries by airship, which was much cheaper. To make matters worse, there weren't any air routes to Stone Forest City, so players would have to make the rest of the trip on their mounts. Unlike Crimson Emperor's experts, ordinary level 100 players generally had common mounts. Factoring in other aspects, such as the spread of information, the war between Zero Wing and the Dark World's forces would have begun long before ordinary players started to visit the city from the various kingdoms and empires. While the new Stone Forest City astonished the various powers, Shifeng had secretly teleported back to White River City to upgrade his Night Division. While expert players served as a guild's foundation in God's domain, a guild needed a strong Night Division if it wished to set roots down in level 100+ neutral maps. Since Shifeng had previously lacked the necessary funds, he had refrained from upgrading his Night Division. However, money was no longer a problem. With the profits from selling the Western Continent's materials and Stone Forest City's entrance fees, he now had a total of 5 million gold sitting in his bag. Holding on to all this money would be a huge waste, especially now that Stone Forest City was the first intermediate city in a level 100 neutral map. He could definitely recruit plenty of knights with high growth potential. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Starmoon Kingdom, White River City's Adventurers Association. News of Stone Forest City's upgrade had already reached the masses, and practically every player in the Adventurers Association was discussing the matter when Shifeng arrived. Many independent players expressed their eager intentions to develop near the city, particularly those with their own fixed parties or teams. Nodding in satisfaction, Shifeng climbed the stairs to the Adventurers Association's second floor and entered one of the VIP rooms. Lord Bronze Legatee, how may I be of service? Senior Administrator Lorraine asked, smiling as she walked up to him. I wish to see the current recruitment status and promotion list for my Night Division, Shifeng informed her with a grin. Chapter 2555. All new Night Division. Lorraine nodded to Shifeng's request and promptly left to retrieve the relevant information. After a short moment, the senior administrator returned with a thick book, placing it on the table before him. There's so many? Shifeng asked, glancing down at the tome. Lorraine had only given him a sheet of paper during his last visit when he had requested to see his Night Division's recruitment status. Yet now, she had an entire book for him. Normally, if there were fewer than 30,000 applicants, players would only be given a sheet of paper. They'd receive another sheet for every 10,000 applicants beyond that, and would only receive a complete book once more than 100,000 NPCs applied for their Night Division. Shifeng had already recruited NPCs from many NPC cities, and could reasonably assume he had accepted or rejected most interested NPCs. Hence, he shouldn't see too many more new applications. Receiving another 50,000 would be a miracle, and yet more than 100,000 new NPCs had applied. Initially, Lord Bronze Legatee, you hadn't received many applicants. However, due to the large number of other races visiting Stone Forest City, the number of interested individuals has considerably increased, Lorraine explained. The Freedom City title's benefits have taken effect so soon? The explanation stunned Shifeng. He had thought he'd have to wait a few more days before the title took effect. He had just promoted Stone Forest City and assumed the system would make him wait. However, it seemed that he had somewhat underestimated the new title. A total of 112,672 people have applied to serve as your knights. Among them, 83,241 are human, 27,412 are Orcish, 1,836 are Elven, and 183 are giants. This book has the records of all of these applicants' information, Lorraine continued, ignoring Shifeng's muttering. Nearly 30,000 NPCs from other races? If the superpowers of the past found out about this, wouldn't they go mad? Shifeng could not help his growing excitement. Recruiting NPCs from other races for their Night Divisions was incredibly difficult for players. The other races had smaller populations than humans. Normally, the The various superpowers would be overjoyed if even several thousand non-human NPCs applied to serve as knights. And yet, Shifeng had nearly 30,000 of these applicants, certainly a frightening number. Not even a 2-star lord might receive so many throughout a full year. Most importantly, elves and giants had applied in considerably large numbers. The situation had completely exceeded his expectations. In God's domain, the Orcish population was only second to the humans. Ors typically made up the majority of non-human NPC applicants. Of course, that didn't discount Or knight strength. On the contrary, Or NPCs were quite powerful. They were natural-born warriors with sharp senses and robust frames that were far superior to humans. Excluding heroes, human fighters were no match for Or fighters of the same level and tier. The human race's superior research and creativity were the reason that Ors weren't a match for humans, and forced to live far from the main continent's fertile lands. However, if one could assemble the Ors scattered across the continent and form a melee unit, the force would be absolutely unstoppable in battle. Shaking off his shock, Shifeng immediately inspected the recruitment list. When he had arrived, he had only planned to recruit new knights with high growth potential to replace some of his weaker NPCs, but now he had many more changes to make to his knight division. Time flew by, and without taking a break, Shifeng had spent over 20 hours browsing the recruitment list. He was more focused on the list than he was during boss fights. Thankfully, I brought plenty of coins with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have enough to pay the dismissal fees. Shifeng revealed a bitter smile as he finished reading the list. If things had gone according to his original plan, he would have only been able to replace a small fraction of his Knight Division's members, but now that he could recruit non-human NPCs, which would be bound to him for life, things had changed. Once he recruited non-human NPCs, he couldn't dismiss or replace them. Hence, he had to be extremely careful when choosing non-human knights. Fortunately, non-human NPCs were much cheaper to recruit and maintain than human NPCs. They were generally 30% cheaper. All things considered, it wasn't a bad transaction. Moreover, non-human NPCs tended to be quite talented. In fact, more than half of the non-human NPCs in God's domain were Bronze Knight standard or above, which was one of the reasons that the various powers of the past had preferred non-human NPCs. Of the 27,412 Ors that had applied to join Shifeng's Knight Division, 15,123 were Tier 2 Bronze Knights. The ratio was unheard of among human NPCs. However, it was quite normal with Ors. Many Tier 3 Ors had also sent in applications, and they all had considerably high potential. Even the weakest among them was at the mysterious Iron Standard, while 45 were at the secret Silver Standard, and 1 Fine Gold Standard or had applied. The Elven and Giant applicants were just as shocking. Elves were natural-born mages, with higher growth potential than most races. Even the weakest elf that applied was Bronze rank, while as many as 43 were secret Silver rank, and 2 were Fine Gold rank. Moreover, every elf applicant was Tier 3. Although giants made up the majority of applicants, with only 183, 13 were Tier 3 Secret Silver Knights, and 1 was a Tier 3 Fine Gold Knight. More than 100 Secret Silver and Fine Gold ranked non-human NPCs had applied to Shifeng's Knight Division, many times more than those among the 80,000 plus human applicants. Lord Bronze Legatee, have you made your decision? Lorraine asked when Shifeng closed the book. MHM. I want all knights with secret silver potential and above. I also want these mysterious iron knights with high growth potential, and the remaining Tier 3 knights, Shifeng replied, nodding. Normally, an NPC knight needed at least mysterious iron growth potential before they could be promoted to Tier 3. Even in the later stages of God's domain, Tier 3 NPCs would be considered a powerful force. After all, very few players could reach Tier 4. Even if they did, a group of Tier 3 NPCs, backed by a city's magic array, wouldn't be an easy opponent. If enough Tier 3 NPCs formed a battle array, they could slay Tier 4 players. This was why, even after reaching Tier 4, players could only afford to act conceited in the fields. Very well. There are 152 applicants with secret silver potential or above. Including the rest, there are a total of 326 Tier 3 knights. Calculating the recruitment fee of the 1,872 Tier 3 Mysterious Iron Knights with high potential, and some of your current Knights' dismissal fees, your bill comes to 554,600 gold. Lorraine explained after taking a moment to tally his total. Please include the promotion fees for the 437 members of my Knight division, Shifeng said. Giving the matter some thought, he continued. I also want to outfit my Tier 3 Knights with epic equipment. How much will that come to? That will raise the price considerably. If we include the 437 people that will be promoted to Tier 3, you will need an additional 5,640,000 gold to arm all of your Tier 3 Knights with epic equipment. With the prior fees, your total comes to 6,198,970 gold. Lorraine responded, giving Shifeng a skeptical look. After giving the matter some more thought, Shifeng said, reduce the number slightly then. I'll take 1,150 sets. That won't be a problem. Your total will be 5,158,970 gold. Once we process the payment, the merchandise will be delivered within 3 hours. The new knights will arrive at your city lord's mansion within 1 hour, Lorraine calmly stated. Shifeng then nearly emptied his bag of coins, and in the blink of an eye, he was once again a pauper. Nurturing a knight division really is expensive. It's no wonder why all of the superpowers that had knight divisions were poor, Shifeng muttered, bitterly smiling at the less than 3,000 gold in his bag, while Shifeng upgraded his knight division. In a remote canyon in the distant Cold Spring Forest, a group of black-clad magical class players chanted an incantation along the edge of a gigantic magic array. The array covered a 200-yard radius, and in its center stood an indifferent, handsome youth with a night-black crystal in his left hand, while writing a series of divine runes with his right. With each line of completed runes, a shard broke off of the crystal and disintegrated. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. When the crystal was nearly gone, the youth completed the final line of divine runes. Suddenly, the sky above the magic array split, and a colossal door dropped from the spatial tear. The door was over 100 meters tall and covered in ancient runes, radiating a mighty aura that made everyone nearby shudder. Once the door landed, it began to part down the middle. Excellent! It's complete! Flaming Light exclaimed as the door began to open. He then glanced at the middle-aged man standing nearby and said, Heart, notify the various powers and tell them that the door is open. Whether they cherish this opportunity or not is up to them. Understood. Furious Heart respectfully responded, crossing the threshold with his team. Chapter 2556, Crazy Freedom Hotel Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City. As news regarding Stone Forest City spread to more independent players, the number of small adventurer teams visiting the city continued to increase. Less than a day after the city's reopening, it had become somewhat crowded, and even more players had lined up to enter the city. A 6-man party of cloaked players, all radiating darkness energy, stood among the long line, and none of the nearby players even dared to take half a step closer to them. Those players' killing intent is so strong. Not even dark players, who constantly slaughter others in the fields, have such intense hostility. Who are those people? Their killing intent isn't the only thing that's intense. Look at their equipment. They might have concealed the glow effect, but all of their items are engraved with magic runes. Their equipment should be fine gold rank or higher. Level 105 fine gold equipment. Not even the various superpowers main force members necessarily have such top-tier items. Although the independent players nearby were afraid of the 6-man party, they couldn't help but envy the party's equipment. Ever since mainstream players had reached level 100, demand for level 100 plus secret silver weapons and equipment had skyrocketed, but supply remained incredibly low. Thus, these items' prices had substantially increased. Not even ordinary expert players could afford level 100 plus fine gold weapons or equipment. Even the various superpowers main force members would throw a party if they acquired just one such weapon or equipment piece. However, the weakest piece the 6-man party wore was level 105 fine gold rank, and all of their equipment bore magic runes. To ordinary players, the equipment was divine. Despite noticing the surrounding players' envious looks, the members of the six-man party didn't respond. I guess the main continent's ordinary experts don't amount to much. Not only do they have such poor weapons and equipment, but they don't even know about magic enhancement. Once the army has gathered, the Dark World will likely claim this area as new territory in the blink of an eye. A gray-clad, Tier 3 cursemancer with a military haircut disdainfully dismissed as he glanced at the independent experts around him. You shouldn't say such things, old Flash. After all, the environment in this area is no match for what we have in the Dark World. These players only have to worry about monsters in the fields, while we are always on the lookout for monster and player ambushes. It's only natural that our world's players have developed so much faster. A middle-aged, bearded man with simple features chided, chuckling. Besides, ordinary experts are just that. The various major powers experts are much stronger. Otherwise, our two guilds wouldn't have signed a non-interference pact with Zero Wing. I guess, but I still don't get why our guilds wanted to partner with Zero Wing in the first place. You must have seen how powerful that army was on our way here. How could Zero Wing possibly stop that kind of force? We shouldn't have a reason to pay Zero Wing 500,000 darkness crystals. The cursemancer named Magic Flash grumbled. 500,000 darkness crystals was no small price, even to their guilds. They certainly weren't worth a non-interference agreement from Zero Wing in their fight for resources in Cold Spring Forest. The only thing Zero Wing could do when facing the Dark World's countless players was hold inside the city. I don't know, but the higher-ups have their own reasons. We just need to complete the task they've assigned us, the middle-aged man said, shaking his head. In all honesty, the situation confused him too. The number of Dark World players preparing to invade Cold Spring Forest was no laughing matter. Several million players had already joined the invading army, and more were on their way. News of the open pathway had just begun to spread, and it would take time for the information to reach the far corners of the Dark World. Based on their guild's estimates, the army should easily include tens of millions of players, possibly over 100 million. Not even the neighboring kingdoms and empires stood a chance against such a force, much less Zero Wing. The Dark World's army would definitely cause a massive commotion when it arrived on the main continent. While Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members conversed, they crossed Stone Forest City's gates. The mana here sure is dense. If Dark Rhapsody's guild cities had this much mana, we'd easily become the #1 guild in the Dark World. Magic Flash noticed, envious when he felt the mesmerizing mana in the air. It is certainly astonishing. It's no wonder why so many superpowers want this city, the bearded middle-aged man replied. What a pity. If Demon's Heart hadn't opened the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest, Zero Wing might have become a massive threat to the various superpowers, Magic Flash said, glancing around at the crowd of players and NPC merchants. Seeing so many people, he more or less understood why his superiors had decided to ally with Zero Wing. Stone Forest City was no less prosperous than major NPC cities. With a guild city like this under its control, Zero Wing would have no worries about its development. Since Cold Spring Forest was a level 100 neutral map, every player here had a certain degree of strength. Including the conveniences the city offered, not only could Zero Wing continue to recruit and nurture more expert players, but its members' average levels would gradually surpass the various superpowers as well. Zero Wing definitely had the potential to become a titan in God's domain. Maybe, but we shouldn't dwell on it. We should hurry and contact Zero Wing. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can return. If we wait and miss the invasion, it'll become more difficult to establish ourselves in Cold Spring Forest later, the middle-aged man cautioned. I've already contacted the guild. They said we should head toward the tallest building on the main street. Once we're there, someone will take us to meet their guild leader, Magic Flash said. You mean that building? The middle-aged man asked, pointing to the Freedom Hotel in the center of the city. Astonished, he continued. I'm impressed that Zero Wing managed to erect such a tall building. The tallest building either of our guilds has constructed is only a little over 50 meters tall, but that thing is at least 150. So what if it's tall? Someone is still going to take it from them, Magic Flash growled, sneering. The middle-aged man didn't try to refute Magic Flash's assumption. Such a tall building would only be useful for visual impact. Zero Wing would have been far better off spending its money to strengthen its members, in his opinion. Strength meant everything in God's domain. The cloaked players then made their way toward the hotel. They didn't take long to reach it, and when they did, they noticed a long line of players both inside and outside of the Freedom Hotel. Many of the players in line were Tier 3 experts, and some of their auras even made Magic Flash and his companions shudder with fear. There were dozens of those experts, too. Even more surprising, every one of those experts obediently stood in line before the Freedom Hotel's front desk. The scene stupefied Magic Flash and his party. Normally, such experts could act as vice commanders, even commanders of their guild's legions. Players of their caliber warranted respect, regardless of where they were, yet they waited in line with a bunch of ordinary players. What was happening here? Moreover, Magic Flash's party was confused by the fact that every one of those experts, including the peak experts, seemed excited and grateful to receive one of the Freedom Hotel's room tokens from the front desk. Suddenly, Gentle Snow approached the cloaked party, asking, "Are you representatives from Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society?" "That's right, we are," the middle-aged man confirmed, nodding as he spotted the zero-wing emblem Gentle Snow wore. He was more than a little surprised when he sensed Gentle Snow's powerful aura. "In that case, please follow me. Our guild leader is waiting in the reception room upstairs," Gentle Snow said after verifying the party's identity. She then led the party to the elevator that would take them to the appropriate floor. Many of the experts waiting for their room tokens were jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party follow Gentle Snow. Crap. Who are those people? They actually get to use the elevator that'll take them to the 80th floor and beyond. They must be Zero Wing's allies. If I remember correctly, only the hotel's silver members get to stay on those floors. You need more than just coins and magic crystals to become a silver member, too. You also need to earn a large number of membership points. I've heard that not even top adventurer teams' commanders were granted silver memberships. Zero Wing is too stingy. It actually wants us to earn points just to stay in this hotel. I wonder when I'll earn enough to become a silver member. It's not all that unusual. There are only a limited number of rooms available, after all. And I've heard that the advanced rooms on the 80th floor and above are amazing. Not only is the recovery speed there 30% higher than in normal rooms, but each room also has its own training room. Players can practice simple combat techniques by themselves in those training rooms. Seriously? You can actually practice your combat skills in the advanced rooms. This won't do. I need to become a silver member as soon as possible. The players waiting in the Freedom Hotel's lobby were indescribably jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party enter the elevator. Their reactions confused the dark players. A short moment later, the group arrived on the Freedom Hotel's top floor. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. The instant Magic Flash and the others set foot on the Freedom Hotel's top floor, their minds felt serene. To be precise, they felt mentally refreshed as if their thoughts had found their own unique paths. They could now conceptualize ideas without confusion. So this is Zero Wing. Magic Flash and the others couldn't help but gasp when they felt the change. They had already been astonished by the Freedom Hotel's mana, but compared to this environment, the lobby was nothing. If they could train on this floor, they'd see results dozens of times faster. They might even be able to break into the Void Realm. Our guild leader is inside. Please go in, Gentle Snow said, not surprised in the slightest to see the 6 players' astonished expressions. She simply smiled as she opened the reception room's doors. Chapter 2557. Astonishing Foundations. Gentle Snow's request yanked Magic Flash and the others from their reverie, and they walked into the VIP reception room with awkward expressions. As they entered the room, however, they were once again left speechless. The refreshed sensation they had enjoyed in the hall had been amazing, but it was amplified several times the moment they set foot in the reception room. The strange energy in the room was clearly denser than in the hall. If they could train inside this reception room for a few days, their combat standards would reach the next level. Even the various powers would treat a room like this like a sacred training ground, barring entry to anyone other than core members. And yet, Zero Wing used it as a reception room. Extravagance. This was too extravagant. A male swordsman reclined on one of the sofas in the reception room, wearing a simple set of equipment and a black cloak across his back. Opposite of the swordsman was a woman who had barely reached level 100. The woman radiated no aura whatsoever, and looked even weaker than ordinary players. However, the advanced Master Forger's insignia the woman wore was extraordinarily eye-catching. The woman was none other than Melancholic Smile, who had been busy managing the candlelight trading firm. After long hours of crafting and frantic research, she had successfully become an advanced Master Forger, as well. Guild Leader, this is our current limit. The forging techniques involved are simply too delicate and complex. Crafting a successful product in a short time is impossible, I'm afraid. Melancholic Smile disappointedly insisted as she placed several pieces of equipment on the table between her and Shifeng. The moment she did, Magic Flash and the other's eyes widened in shock. Not only were the several equipment pieces part of the same set, but they also carried the glow of fine gold equipment. In other words, the equipment placed on the table was a fine gold set equipment. Moreover, it was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. Even Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had only found a few sets, yet Zero Wing could craft it. And based on Melancholic Smile's comment, that was a failed product. Meanwhile, as Magic Flash's party entered the reception room, Shifeng's gaze shifted to his guests. You must be Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives. Please have a seat, Shifeng said. When he noticed that Magic Flash's group couldn't pull their eyes from the failed items on the table, he chuckled and said, It seems you are very interested in this Dark Demon set. After returning to Stone Forest City, he had immediately instructed Gentle Snow to pass the Dark Demon set forging design to Melancholic Smile for research and production. He had enough responsibilities at the moment, and didn't have the time to forge the set equipment himself. In contrast, Melancholic Smile could and did devote her free time to forging. Hence, she improved her skills a lot faster than Shifeng could. She had even become an advanced master forger before he had. The candlelight trading firm also had Cream Coco, who focused all of her time on forging since she didn't have any management duties as Melancholic Smile did. She improved even faster than Melancholic Smile, and had become the first advanced master forger in candlelight. Now the trading firm had two. Unfortunately, the Dark Demon set proved far more difficult to produce than Shifeng had expected. And even after working together, Cream Coco and Melancholic Smile had barely managed to craft one fine gold set. Moreover, their production success rate wasn't particularly high. Even after involving all sorts of tools and rare materials, they had only managed to raise their success rate to 50%. I apologize for our earlier rude behavior. The bearded middle-aged man from Deity Society hurriedly apologized. It's just that level 100 plus fine gold set equipment is a truly rare sight. I had never imagined that Zero Wing was capable of crafting such equipment. It surprised me, but rest assured, we won't reveal this secret to anyone. It's fine. This doesn't need to be a secret. Since Dark Rhapsody, Deity Society, and Zero Wing are allies, you don't need to behave like outsiders. If you are interested, I can sell you a few sets, Shifeng nonchalantly offered. Zero Wing's possession of the Dark Demon set forging design had already been exposed. Only news of it hadn't reached the Eastern continent. Hence, there was no need to keep it a secret. Moreover, Shifeng intended to store these fine gold-ranked Dark Demon sets in the guild warehouse, making them available for purchase later. Once he did, there would be no containing the information. Besides, the sooner the public learned about the Dark Demon set, the better. That way, Zero Wing could use the set to attract more experts to join the guild. Are you serious, Guild Leader Black Flame? Magic Flash could not help but ask. That was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If he could get his hands on such a set, his combat power would increase by at least 30%. He might even catch up to peak experts of the same level. Of course, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the passionate light in Magic Flash's gaze. However, it won't be cheap and I won't sell them for coins. He did not mind selling the fine gold-ranked Dark Demon set. This was only a failed product, after all, and at this point, most superpowers had at least a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Selling some to Zero Wings partners wouldn't harm his guild in any way. What do you want for the set then? Magic Flash eagerly asked. Darkness crystals, Shifeng said. My price isn't very high. What do you think of 15,000 crystals? The various powers still thought only dark players needed darkness crystals, but they didn't realize that as God's Domain's lifestyle players continued to develop, attributed magic crystals would become more valuable. Weapons and equipment crafted with attributed magic crystals would gain additional properties related to the crystals. Such changes wouldn't be visible in the item's attribute panel, but in the hands of Tier 3 players and above, they'd perform considerably better, especially for players with fully unlocked mana bodies. Fortunately, darkness crystals were relatively easy to acquire in the dark world. Hence, Shifeng had decided to collect some before the various powers realized their value. 15,000 crystals per set. Magic Flash was shocked. Isn't that a little too much? Guild leader Black Flame. Level 100 plus fine gold set equipment was indeed very rare, and some of the best equipment available in God's Domain right now. But darkness crystals were similarly rare and valuable. In fact, they were worth even more than magic crystals to dark players. Guild leader Black Flame, is what you say really true? The bearded middle-aged man suddenly interrupted. Why would I lie? I want 15,000 darkness crystals per set. If you wish to buy them, you may do so whenever you wish, Shifeng said. He could not help but feel a little exasperated at the middle-aged man's question. Before Magic Flash could refuse the offer, the middle-aged man from Deity Society continued. Deity Society will buy them. We'll buy as many sets as you're willing to sell us. The older man declared, determined. Have you gone insane, Old Forest? Magic Flash was astonished. What a joke. The Dark Demon set was just a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. 15,000 darkness crystals would be the maximum anyone would pay for such a set. Yet his companion jumped at the chance to buy them. Magic Flash couldn't think of any sane reason why he'd act like this. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. You wait. Something's not right. Magic Flash realized something felt off when he saw the bearded man's nonchalant reaction. He immediately activated his identification skill and turned to the Dark Demon set on the table. Both Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had sent players with advanced identification skills to lead their respective groups as insurance. While Magic Flash led Dark Rhapsody's team, Deity Society's leader for this party was Old Forest. There had to be a problem for Old Forest to act like this. Don't bother with an appraisal, Old Flash. The fine gold set equipment on the table isn't some level 105 set. It's a top-tier fine gold set equipment that players can use until level 120. No one had ever found anything like it in the dark world. Old Forest whispered as Magic Flash used his own advanced identification skill. Chapter 2558. Wildly arrogant Zero Wing. Upon hearing Old Forest's words, Magic Flash gasped. Fine gold set equipment that can be used up to level 120? Currently, the best-known fine gold set equipment in the dark world could be used only up to level 105. Even Dark Rhapsody's peak experts sported only level 105 dark gold equipment, which was the equivalent of level 110 fine gold equipment. Hardly comparable to level 110 fine gold set equipment. Level 120 fine gold set equipment was simply unimaginable. That's right. Aside from level 100 plus epic equipment, there's no better equipment than this in the entire dark world. Old Forest said, nodding as he tried to suppress the excitement in his heart. If the price was indeed 15,000 darkness crystals for level 120 fine gold set equipment, then it was definitely acceptable. This was especially true when the dark world's various powers were frantically raiding level 100 team dungeons. Due to the abysmally low drop rate for level 100 plus weapons and equipment, these powers were not making any significant progress with their dungeon raids. This, in turn, led to a stagnation in their development. If he could secure a batch of Dark Demon sets for Divine Society, then his guild would have a massive advantage over the other guilds. With this advantage, they could easily earn back the cost of the Dark Demon sets. As soon as Old Forest finished speaking, excitement also shone in Magic Flash's eyes. Magic Flash immediately said, Guild Leader Black Flame, Dark Rhapsody will also buy everything you have. Darkness crystals definitely aren't a problem. If he could get his hands on multiple Dark Demon sets, then the plate armor classes of the guild's main force would be in for a wonderful time. They wouldn't have to worry about finding equipment before reaching level 125. Moreover, the main force would also have a much easier time raiding level 100 team dungeons. In fact, Dark Rhapsody might even become the first guild in the Dark World to clear a 100-man, level 100 team dungeon. The Dark Demon set's production is much more difficult than you think. I don't have many sets available. Even now, we have managed to produce only 4 sets, Shifeng said, chuckling at the longing expressions of the two people before him. Shifeng wished he could produce as many Dark Demon sets as he wanted. However, the Dark Demon set was actually level 110 to level 120 Dark Gold set equipment. The materials needed to produce it were extremely rare, which severely limited its production volume. Moreover, even when making the failed version of the Dark Demon set, the production success rate was only 50%. Only 4 sets? Magic Flash and Old Forest felt a little disappointed when they heard Shifeng's words. However, after giving the matter some thought, they found it reasonable. After all, this was level 120 fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If it were so easy to produce, Zero Wing would be invincible. Of course, it isn't exactly impossible if your 2 guilds wish to purchase them in large quantities, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the disappointment on the 2 men's faces. Upon hearing Shifeng's words, Old Forest immediately understood what Shifeng was insinuating. Without hesitation he replied, "Guild leader Black Flame, please state your conditions. So long as they are within my authority, I can definitely agree to them on behalf of Deity Society." Just being able to purchase a few Dark Demon sets at 15,000 darkness crystals per set could already be considered a miracle. All the more so for purchasing a large batch of the sets. With a sufficiently large number of the sets, a guild could raise the overall strength of its main force by a large margin. Zero Wing was naturally under no obligation to give away such a wonderful opportunity to their 2 guilds. "It is the same for my side as well," Magic Flash said. If he missed out on such a windfall, his guild leader and the elders of the guild would beat him to death when he returned. On the other hand, if he succeeded in this negotiation, then he would make a huge contribution to the guild. Although the production of the Dark Demon set is difficult, manufacturing several sets a day is still feasible. Zero Wing is willing to supply these sets to your 2 guilds long-term, Shifeng said. However, I hope that your 2 guilds can help Zero Wing's candlelight trading firm establish itself in the Dark World's major NPC cities, and guarantee the safety of its operation. Silence momentarily fell over the entire room after Shifeng finished speaking, as both Magic Flash and Old Forest looked at him in astonishment. They never thought that Zero Wing's guild leader had such enormous ambitions. The Dark World was equivalent to roughly 3 ordinary empires on the main continent. The other world's player population was larger than even that of the Fire Dragon Empire, one of the 4 great empires of God's domain. As the Dark World had been sealed all this time, it had almost no contact with the main continent whatsoever. Hence, the Dark World's various powers thoroughly monopolized the other world's NPC cities. Moreover, the NPC cities found in the Dark World were different from those found on the main continent in that players held partial authority over them, which made taking over the Dark World's NPC cities incredibly difficult for outside powers. Meanwhile, the opening of the Dark World's portal now presented both the Dark World's powers and the main continent's powers with a huge business opportunity. Needless to say, the main continent's various superpowers would definitely contest over this opportunity, and would naturally be willing to offer unimaginable prices. Guild leader Black Flame, I'm afraid I don't have the authority to decide on such a matter, Old Forest stated honestly. Moreover, this matter involves a lot of interests. Even if Zero Wing is offering up the Dark Demon set, I do not believe my superiors will agree to your condition. As for Magic Flash, he inwardly rolled his eyes at Shifeng's demand. The Dark Demon set might be capable of further elevating the strength of their guild's main forces, but its value was nothing compared to the wealth of 3 empires worth of players. This was also one of the reasons why the various superpowers were avoiding hostilities with dark guilds, as doing so would mean losing a massive business opportunity. At this moment, let alone team leaders like Magic Flash and Old Forest, even the other 4 members of the party disdained Shifeng. Shifeng was actually trying to secure such a huge business opportunity by offering just a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Did he take them for fools? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Moreover, Zero Wing was already having problems keeping its position in Cold Spring Forest. Yet Shifeng actually wanted to enter the Dark World's various NPC cities. This was a complete and utter joke. Don't be in such a rush to reject my offer. I understand that this involves a lot of benefits. I know even the Dark Demon set is insufficient to persuade your 2 guilds, Shifeng said, chuckling at the duo's reactions. However, what if I can make it so that the people of your 2 guilds can freely move between the Dark World and Cold Spring Forest, while everyone else from the Dark World cannot? Guild leader Black Flame, what do you mean? Old Forest asked, unable to grasp Shifeng's meaning. Guild leader Black Flame, you should know that the portal connecting the Dark World and the main continent has already been opened. The Dark World's players can come and go as they wish. This is something even Flaming Light, the holder of the portal's key, cannot stop. What can Zero Wing possibly do? Magic Light said, laughing. I don't know whether Flaming Light can stop those players or not, but from now onward, Zero Wing is taking ownership of the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest. Shifeng said, smiling. He paid no attention to the ridicule Magic Flash and the others were displaying. Chapter 2559. Heading toward the Dark World? Magic Flash and his companions stared at Shifeng in stunned silence. How arrogant! This swordsman was wildly arrogant. Not even the main continent's super guilds would dare spout such nonsense. They were talking about all of the players in an entire otherworld, and not just any ordinary otherworld, but one subjected to cruel competition. Residents of the Dark World had to be extremely careful. Not only could a single mistake cost them their lives, but someone else could also benefit from their hard work. Hence, the Dark World had almost no ordinary players. Most would delete their accounts and try to start over in another world after spending just a few days in the other world. The players that chose to remain were either experts or particularly skilled at survival. When tens of millions of these players swarmed Cold Spring Forest, not even 5 superpowers working together could stop them all, much less a single superpower. Even if the various superpowers on the main continent banded together, they'd pay an unimaginable price to defeat the Dark World's denizens. Their losses might be severe enough to cause their eventual collapse. Shifeng, however, had just declared that Zero Wing could take control of the Dark World's portal. For a moment, Magic Flash and his party wondered if this swordsman had lost his mind. Did the man assume that he owned God's domain? Guild leader Black Flame, I don't mean to doubt you, but this matter does involve too many interests. I do not have the authority to agree to such a deal, Old Forest insisted. After taking in a deep breath, he continued. Only my guild leader can preside over this matter. The most I can do is inform him of your offer. I cannot say whether or not he'll agree. That's right. Why don't we return and discuss this with our guild leaders for now? Later we'll return with the results of those discussions, Magic Flash suggested, nodding in agreement. Inwardly, however, he had already decided that Shifeng was a lunatic. While the Dark Demon set might be valuable, obtaining fine gold set equipment wouldn't be an issue once their guilds began to negotiate alliances with the various superpowers. The only downside was that the various superpowers couldn't provide fine gold set equipment that players could use until level 120. However, it would be more than enough to raid team dungeons and grind for levels. Even as a lifestyle player, Melancholic Smile could tell that Magic Flash and Old Forest were making perfunctory promises, let alone Shifeng, whose 5 senses had already reached their limits. I understand. With so many interests involved, reaching a swift decision will be very difficult for your 2 guilds. Zero Wing isn't in a rush, so I have no problems waiting for you to relay the situation to your guild leaders, Shifeng calmly agreed. Please rest assured, guild leader Black Flame. We'll inform our guild leaders upon our return, Old Forest said, nodding. Following which, Magic Frost and Old Forest each handed Shifeng their promised 250,000 darkness crystals, before leaving the Freedom Hotel. and making their way back to the dark world. Once they left, Gentle Snow frowned. Guild leader, now that the dark world's portal has opened, should we restrict our guild members' range of activity? Gentle Snow asked. She hadn't expected the portal to open so quickly. Fortunately, Zero Wing had reached an agreement with Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society regarding the Darkness Crystal's delivery as soon as it did. Otherwise, Zero Wing wouldn't have known when the portal opened and would have lost its opportunity to prepare for battle. That won't be necessary. Since the Dark World's portal is open, we should visit this other world. Contact Fire's team and the Hell Legion and inform them to gather, Shifeng said, chuckling. Are we really going there? Shifeng's decision surprised her. When Shifeng had declared his intentions to Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives, she hadn't thought it was nonsense in the least. As long as Zero Wing had enough time, it was entirely possible. Not only did the guild now have the Freedom Hotel, but the guild as a whole also earned a daily net profit of more than 100,000 gold. Moreover, Zero Wing's coin and magic crystal income would continue to increase as Stone Forest City's player population did. With the Freedom Hotel to attract players, more expert players would flood into the city as well. With so many advantages, growing until it ruled Cold Spring Forest with an iron fist was entirely possible. Now, however, including the Hell Legion, Zero Wing only had a little over 500 Tier 3 experts under its command. Even if they included the 600 or so Tier 3 knights, they weren't powerful enough to challenge the Dark World in its entirety. We're heading there now. If we don't hurry, it'll be too late, Shifeng stated, determination lacing his tone. All right. I'll notify Fire and the others, Gentle Snow answered. Although she didn't understand what Shifeng intended, they shouldn't have any problems surviving. Melancholic. How is the construction of the Crimson Dragon flying ships coming along? Shifeng asked, turning to the Candlelight's manager. Excluding the one in your possession, we have a total of 5 Crimson Dragon flying ships ready, Melancholic's smile proudly informed him. Although more players now had flying mounts of their own, 5 flying ships were more than enough for Zero Wing to rule the skies. Not one of God's domain's other powers could threaten the guild in the air. Good. Get them ready, Shifeng said, nodding. While Gentle Snow and Melancholic Smile saw to their preparations, Magic Flash and his team flew back to the Dark World's portal atop their darkness bats. Upon their return to their home Otherworld, they noticed the swarm of dark players and tents filling the gravel plain 1,000 yards ahead. There were easily millions of dark players in the camp. Every one of these dark players practically vibrated with darkness energy and bloodlust, and even the lowest leveled among them was level 105. Quite a few were also Tier 3 experts. We haven't been gone that long, yet so many more have already gathered, Magic Flash exclaimed, watching the massive crowd below. From what he could tell, at least 4 or 5 million players had set up in the camp. In comparison, the several tens of thousands of players Dark Rhapsody had dispatched were nothing. When Magic Flash thought back to Shifeng's arrogant claim, he couldn't help but view the man as even more of a fool. However, Magic Flash and Old Forest continued to carry out their duties and inform their higher-ups of Shifeng's proposal. Within a conference tent containing hundreds of players, Black Flame is insane. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, he'll have a hard time just protecting himself. Yet he has designs on our other world? When Blue Rainbow, the female Dark Knight from Dark Rhapsody, heard Magic Flash and Old Forest report, she could not help but laugh. It's probably because he hasn't seen the gathered army yet. Once he does, like the various superpowers from earlier, he'll likely abandon the naive thought. Deity Society's Elder Gold replied, similarly smiling. A few superpowers who had been informed of the portal's opening had sent representatives to the Dark World not long ago. They had wanted to negotiate business deals with the other world's various powers, but when they saw the number of dark players waiting for the impending invasion, every one the representatives had dropped their proposals. Those superpowers representatives had realized that the moment the gathered dark players burst through the open portal, even the neighboring kingdoms and empires would be at risk, let alone Cold Spring Forest. In truth, even the Dark World's top 3 guilds had been surprised by how many players had joined the invading army. They had only estimated that around 20,000 experts would show up. Yet more than 30,000 Tier 3 experts had already joined the camp. At this rate, they wouldn't have any problems gathering 40 or 50,000 Tier 3 experts by the time the invasion began. While Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold spoke in hushed whispers, the various representatives in the tent fell silent. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. It seems everyone is of the same opinion. In that case, there's no point in continuing this discussion. We can still afford to ignore Stone Forest City, but since the Dark World has mustered such a powerful army, we cannot let the main continent's superpowers take our share of the city. A cold, robust man resting in one of the 3 main seats within the tent spoke up. Standing, he continued, "Let us officially advance into Cold Spring Forest. It's time we show the main continent's powers the strength of our Dark World." As the robust man finished speaking, the various representatives ordered their subordinates to march on Cold Spring Forest. The several million players in the plain began to stomp toward the gigantic door before them, shocking the scouts the main continent's superpowers had sent. These scouts immediately contacted their superiors to inform them of the shocking scene. Meanwhile, in an advanced room on the Freedom Hotel's 29th floor. So in the end they're still invading? Yuan Tiexin shook his head and sighed when he read his subordinate's message. Chapter 2560, Darkness Invades. Zero Wing arrives shortly after Yuan Tiexin read his subordinate's message. The door to the quiet room opened. A group of players walked in behind a male half-elf covered in azure sparks. As the half-elf entered the room, all of the fire-type mana began to gather around him as if summoned. As a result, the room's temperature steadily rose. "Shine? What are you doing here?" Yuan Tiexin was surprised to see the male half-elf Scorching Shire. There weren't many people in the secret pavilion that knew the name Scorching Shine, and those who did were generally members of the guild's older generations. While Scorching Shine's current appearance made him look as if he were in his 30s, he was actually over 50. The man had withdrawn from the secret pavilion's front lines many years ago, and was only active behind the scenes. Before Scorching Shine had withdrawn, he had been considered one of the pavilion's absolute monsters. He could even contend with the commander of mythology's strongest trump card legion. He no longer busied himself with guild affairs, however, preferring to focus on his own improvement. Not even Yuan Tiexin, who had a close relationship with Scorching Shrine, could begin to imagine how powerful the man had become. However, Scorching Shrine's individual strength wasn't the reason he was so well known in the secret pavilion. Rather, it was the Scorched Legion under his command. The Scorched Legion was one of the secret pavilion's trump card legions, and Scorching Shrine had personally nurtured every one of its experts. Although the legion only had 200 members, they were all geniuses Scorching Shrine had handpicked from the pavilion's new recruits. Initially, the man had set his sights on Purple Jade as well. Unfortunately, she preferred one-handed swords, and Scorching Shrine's knowledge of the combat style was limited. In the end, she hadn't joined his Scorched Legion. The Scorched Legion was still considered a hidden force, secretly fighting on God's domain's front lines. It existed solely for exploring new maps and almost never meddled in guild affairs. Now, however, Scorching Shine and his legion had come to Stone Forest City, which left Yuan Tiexin a little confused. "We received the command from Vice Guild Leader Dawn. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, she specifically sent me to negotiate with the various superpowers targeting the city," Scorching Shine softly explained. "Vice Guild Leader Dawn sent you to take charge of the situation?" Hearing the news, Yuan Tiexin breathed a sigh of relief. "This is good. With you here, I'm sure those superpowers will show restraint. In that case, Zero Wing might have a chance of fending off their combined assault." Yuan Tiexin had been worried that Dawn Jade had given up on Stone Forest City, but now that the Scorched Legion had arrived, the city had gained an additional layer of defense. The Scorched Legion was no weaker than Netherworld Empire's Hell Legion. In fact, in large-scale combat, the Scorched Legion would easily outperform the Hell Legion since none of its members were human. Aside from half-elves, which were particularly skilled with magic, the Legion had half-orc members, who were formidable melee fighters. Their combat power was leagues greater than human players of the same level and tier. Of course, The secret pavilion had paid a huge price to ensure that the Scorched Legion's members reached Tier 3 as quickly as possible. Don't get excited just yet. Stone Forest City's recent promotion has made the various superpowers even more desperate to obtain it. Even with my legion here, we can't guarantee that Zero Wing will keep the right to rule Stone Forest City. However, if Zero Wing is willing to hand over some of the city's shares, I'm sure keeping the city under its control won't be a problem, Scorching Shine calmly stated. Let's not waste any more time. The Dark World's players are already marching on Cold Spring Forest. We need to prepare quickly. I'm not familiar with Black Flame, so you'll have to contact him. That won't be a problem. I'll inform Zero Wing right away, Yuan Tiexin agreed, nodding. He then contacted his connections in Zero Wing. The various superpowers' combined force wasn't the most worrisome. Rather, the Dark World's forces warranted more concern. Not even the secret pavilion had expected the Dark World to be so powerful. The Otherworld's invading army had more than 5 million experts, and more than 30,000 of them were Tier 3 experts. The army also had more than 50 flying mounts, and to make matters worse, these numbers only grew as time passed. If this army were allowed to flood into Cold Spring Forest, the consequences would be dire. Shortly after Yuan Tiexin contacted Zero Wing, however, he froze in shock. Old Yuan, has something happened with Zero Wing? Scorching Shine asked, his curiosity piqued when he noticed his old comrade's stunned expression. Not long ago, Black Flame led a team to the Dark World's portal. He plans to negotiate with the Dark World's players, Yuan Tiexin grimly explained. Negotiate with the Dark World's players? The news dazed Scorching Shrine as well. He then looked at Yuan Tiexin and asked, are you sure Black Flame's brain is working properly? What a joke. With the portal to the Dark World open, the Otherworld's players were like a pack of starving wolves that had just spotted fresh meat. They'd pounce on anyone they encountered, not wait for negotiations. This was precisely the reason that the various superpowers had ordered their members to stay at least 10,000 yards away from the portal, afraid that they'd lose their subordinates to these ravenous wolves. Shifeng, however, was doing the exact opposite. Instead of strengthening Stone Forest City's defenses, he had taken the initiative to contact the Dark World's players personally. He was heading straight for the portal, basically offering himself up, gift-wrapped, to the Dark World's army. Even the various superpowers were stunned when they learned of Shifeng's plan from their spies in Zero Wing. What was going on? Was Zero Wing about to surrender? Inside another advanced room within the Freedom Hotel. Illusory, it seems Zero Wing will fall, even without the various superpowers' interference. The fierce man from Crimson Emperor said as he read a report from his subordinate. Shaking his head, he continued. We won't even have to wait 2 or 3 days for this war to conclude. Everything will likely end today. This is insane. We're talking about an entire otherworld of experts. Why would he pull such a crazy stunt? Illusory Words couldn't believe her eyes when she read the report. When Shifeng had tried to challenge an entire city with only several hundred players, she had seen a possibility for him to succeed, but trying to repel all of the players from an otherworld was a fool's dream. This was no longer a force an individual power could hope to overcome. While Illusory Words and many others were puzzled by Shifeng's most recent ploy, Furious Heart, who had been busy persuading the Dark World's players to act, received the news. Interesting. It seems Black Flame really loves a fight. He must think this battle will be just like the one in Demon City. Furious Heart laughed as he read the report. Hopefully he doesn't turn and flee after witnessing the Dark World's army. I wouldn't want this to be too boring. Elated, Furious Heart shifted his gaze to the invading army that marched through the portal into Cold Spring Forest. In the face of this army of several million dark players, even a kingdom would fall, much less Zero Wing. Following which, Furious Heart tossed aside the report and led his team through the portal. When the Dark World's players arrived in Cold Spring Forest, a commotion broke out among the army. So this is the main continent? Crap. There are so many rare ores and herbs nearby. This place is ours for the taking. The dark players couldn't help their growing excitement as they drank in the beautiful scenery in Cold Spring Forest. They wanted nothing more than to claim the surrounding resource areas right away. Even the upper echelons from the otherworld's various powers looked around them with a passionate flame burning in their eyes. They had to admit that Cold Spring Forest was a much higher quality than the Dark World's level 100 maps. As long as they could collect these resources, neither their individual development nor their guilds would be a problem. Before the Dark World's residents could celebrate, however, they heard a loud roaring from the distance, a deep rumble that echoed throughout the valley the portal occupied. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Everyone turned toward the origin of the sound. The Dark players then spotted 5 colossal figures flying toward them. As the roaring grew louder, they could begin to distinguish the flying giants' details. Are those flying ships? With a closer look and realizing what the monstrosities were, everyone was stunned. Those 5 flying ships were too massive. The largest flying mounts they had seen would be insignificant beside the steel giants. As the 5 flew in formation, they practically blotted out the sky. Chapter 2561 Zero Wings Foundations. Madness time. Why are so many flying ships here? Did we trigger some kind of event, and NPCs have come to deal with us? The sudden appearance of the 5 flying ships stunned the Dark players emerging from the gigantic door. They all began to talk about the incoming ships, anxious. Flying ships were no longer a foreign concept to God's Domain's players, but their familiarity was precisely the reason that the Dark players were afraid of how powerful the machines were. Flying ships were powerful war weapons and absolute kings in the skies. One of those ships could effortlessly squash humans like ants. Current players, who sorely lacked aerial combat power, saw flying ships as unstoppable and destructive tools. With 5 flying ships approaching, why wouldn't these Dark players worry? Wait, something's not right. There are players aboard the flying ships. A Tier 3 ranger, gifted with sharp vision, shouted as he pointed to the Crimson Dragon flying ships hovering above them. Nearly everyone's eyes narrowed as they tried to get a better look at the ships, and just as the Tier 3 ranger had announced, players stood on each of the flying ships' decks. While they were still too far off to get a clear view of the players, the green diamond markers were undoubtedly above the blurry figures' heads. Who are those people? They actually have flying ships. Could it be a super guild? Their curiosity piqued. The Dark players wondered who piloted the incoming vessels. Flying ships were still far out of reach for the Dark World's residents. They barely had any flying mounts, after all. And yet 5 player-owned flying ships were flying toward them right now. Even the upper echelons from the otherworld's various major powers were stunned. 5 flying ships. Who are these people? What are they trying to accomplish? 1 or 2 flying ships might not be a major problem, but 5 was a little too much. None of them wanted to face such a force in battle. If it did come down to a fight, the outcome wouldn't be in their favor, even if they eventually won. While the Dark World's powers discussed the situation in hushed tones, the 5 ships descended, stopping roughly 100 yards above ground. A figure then jumped from one of the ship's decks, landing in the center of the Dark players' army. The players on the ground unconsciously stepped back, quickly clearing the way for the figure to land unhindered. As the figure landed, the various powers' upper echelons stared with wide, shocked eyes, particularly Magic Flash and Old Forest, who had just returned from their trip to Stone Forest City. The individual who had jumped from one of the flying ships was none other than Zero Wings guild leader, Black Flame. It's him. Impossible. When Magic Flash and Old Forest saw Shurfeng's familiar face, they couldn't believe their eyes. Any power capable of owning 5 flying ships had to be a superpower with heaven-defying strength in their opinions, and yet the reality was that Zero Wing, a guild at risk of obliteration, was responsible for this display. How could they possibly believe this? Sure enough, it is Zero Wing, Blue Rainbow thought, standing behind Magic Flash. Unlike the 2 representatives, she didn't seem all that surprised to see Shurfeng. Is this why he is so confident? The Dark World's general populace considered flying ships to be out of players' reach, but when Dark Rhapsody had investigated Zero Wing's background, it had discovered that the guild owned multiple ships. This was why Shurfeng had failed to surprise her. Of course, she wasn't entirely unfazed. She was a little shocked to discover that Zero Wing had as many as 5 fling ships. It was a few more than her guild's reports had stated. When Furious Heart saw this, his lips formed a tight frown. Intense rage and fear flashed in his eyes as he watched Shifeng. How is this possible? How does Zero Wing have so many flying ships? Furious Heart's eyes were bloodshot as he stared at the steel giants in the air. His guild had already been concerned when they received the report mentioning 3 flying ships in Zero Wing's possession. Now that he knew the guild had 2 more than that, Stone Forest City would be much more difficult to deal with. As the Dark World's major powers recognized Shifeng and were astonished over his guild's foundations, an indifferent, robust man emerged from the crowd. The instant he stepped forward, he attracted all of the major powers' attention, and everyone watched him with respectful gazes. This robust man was Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. He was a legend in the Dark World. Not only had he single-handedly developed world domination to become one of the Otherworld's top 3 guilds, but he was also one of the Dark World's top-ranked experts. Dawn Dominance was precisely why Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society were so afraid of the up-and-coming world domination. He had even been chosen to preside over the earlier war conference. You must be Zero Wing's guild leader, Black Flame, Dawn Dominance addressed Shifeng. I am Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. You could say that I'm one of the leaders for the Dark World's invasion into Cold Spring Forest. May I know the reason for your sudden visit, guild leader Black Flame? You're correct. I am Black Flame, and I've come to inform your Dark World players of something, Shifeng said, nodding. If you wish to persuade us to abandon our conquest of this map, forget about it. The matter was decided the moment the portal opened, Dawn Dominance said. Cold Spring Forest's resources are important to both of us, of which you are well aware, guild leader Black Flame. Of course, we also do not wish to antagonize Zero Wing intentionally, but we can only rely on our own strength to get what we need. I hope you understand, guild leader Black Flame. As Dawn Dominance finished speaking, the countless dark players in earshot nodded in agreement. Why should only the main continent's players benefit from Cold Spring Forest's resources? If one wished to acquire leveling resources, they could do so with their own power. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Does Black Flame really think he can scare away so many dark players with just 5 flying ships? How naive. Furious Heart laughed softly as he watched Shifeng's distant figure. 5 flying ships was an amazingly powerful force, but if Shifeng thought he could stop several million experts from the Dark World with just this, he was a fool. Moreover, the Dark World's invasion army had over 50 flying mounts. Challenging those flying ships was entirely possible. Besides, the various powers present all had their own trump cards, which they could unleash on the steel giants. As Furious Heart's laughter died, however, Shifeng glanced around at the chuckling dark players and shook his head. Guild leader Dawn, I believe you've misunderstood something. I never had any intention of negotiation with any of you. I am only here to tell you one thing. Shifeng said. From this moment on, this teleportation gate is under Zero Wing's control. Chapter 2562. Challenging the Dark World? Silence fell as Shifeng finished his declaration. Magic Flash and Old Forest stared at the swordsman with their mouths ajar. They hadn't actually thought he'd been serious. This was insane. They had assumed Shifeng had been joking back in the Freedom Hotel. And yet, the man had just repeated his intentions straight to the Dark World's various powers and independent players. After a moment, every dark player broke out in riotous laughter. Did this guy come all this way just to tell us a joke? He actually thinks Zero Wing will manage this teleportation gate from now on. Does he really think he can claim ownership by declaring it? Who does this guy think he is? For a time, the countless dark players expressed their anger and ridicule. Their prior fear and awe had evaporated like fog on a hot day. They wondered how hard Shifeng had hit his head to provoke the Dark World in its entirety so boldly. What is Black Flame trying to do? Did he give himself a concussion and lose his mind? Doesn't he realize that he basically just declared war on everyone in the Dark World? Blue Rainbow frowned at Shifeng, who still seemed quite calm. When they had heard Magic Flash and Old Forest report, they had considered Shifeng's intentions a joke. Now, however, Shifeng had publicly announced Zero Wing's plan to take control of the teleportation gate. If this was a joke, it wasn't funny. As far as she was concerned, this swordsman either overestimated himself or was on a path of self-destruction. Not even multiple cooperating super guilds would dare spout such nonsense before the Dark World's army, much less a single superpower. Anyone that took control of the teleportation gate would reign over the Dark World. This was beyond foolish. He's dead. He's definitely dead now. Furious Heart laughed maniacally as he watched Shifeng. Thanks to Shifeng's announcement, the Dark World's various powers and independent experts would stop at nothing to obliterate Zero Wing. Even if Demon's Heart didn't pull any strings, they likely wouldn't let the matter rest until they had removed any trace of Zero Wing from Cold Spring Forest. If they didn't, the main continent's players would look down on them, which was something the Dark World's denizens and powers wouldn't allow. Once the Dark World's collective laughter died down, each of these dark players turned lethal gazes on Shifeng, killing intent radiating from them in waves. Some Tier 3 experts even unsheathed their weapons, preparing to teach this arrogant swordsman a lesson. What a pity, Guild Leader Black Flame. I had hoped you were smart enough to know when to advance and when to retreat, but it would seem that Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had thought too highly of you, Dawn Dominance said, shaking his head. He then turned to leave, with no intention of continuing his conversation with Shifeng. A unit of 5 flying ships might be impressive, but it wasn't intimidating enough to force the Dark World's invading army to back down. While war weapons had frightening power and deadly potential, their attack rates were very low. When there wasn't much of a difference between two sides' combat power, an additional 5 flying ships would prove miraculously effective, but if one side had an overwhelming combat power advantage, the ships couldn't turn the tide of battle. At Tier 3, expert players were more than agile enough to evade flying ships' attacks as long as there was enough distance between them. Furthermore, the invading army had more than 50 flying mounts, just as much aerial combat power as Zero Wing. When Dawn Dominance left, the surrounding Tier 3 experts smirked and moved to surround Shifeng. Nearly 1,000 Tier 3 experts pointed their weapons at the swordsman, their combined killing intent so powerful that the air around them grew cold and cloudy. The Tier 2 dark players that had come to Cold Spring Forest to join the fun couldn't contain their excitement as they watched. Not even superpowers had so many Tier 3 experts, yet the Dark World's army had so many more. When less than 50 yards separated these dark experts and Shifeng, figures began to drop from the hovering flying ships, one after another. In the blink of an eye, nearly 500 Tier 3 experts took their places around Shifeng, and every one of them radiated a more intense aura than the Dark World's Tier 3 experts. Seeing reinforcements arrive, the encroaching dark players came to a halt. The various major powers spectating upper echelons were similarly astonished. They had never dreamed that Zero Wing could muster such strength. Now that 500 Tier 3 experts had joined the fray, the Dark World's top 3 guilds would be no match for Zero Wing's force, even if they worked together. Including the flying ships still looming above them, engaging in battle now would only invite Zero Wing to slaughter those top 3 guilds. It's no wonder why you dared to spout such nonsense. Zero Wing is actually quite formidable. Dawn Dominance had stopped, turning to glance at the Tier 3 experts around Shifeng, but he shook his head and continued. However, I'm afraid that still won't be enough to defeat the Dark World. As he finished speaking, more Tier 3 dark players swarmed around Shifeng. In less than 30 seconds, a group of over 6,000 Tier 3 dark players had joined the encirclement. Even Blue Frost and his Zero Wing companions from Shelter 1, all of whom had participated in numerous battles, couldn't help but frown. Blue, what do you think the guild leader is trying to do? We're not really going to fight against all those people, are we? Best Reincarnation, the leader of Shelter 1's second party, nervously asked. He had watched and fought in multiple wars involving tens of thousands of players, but compared to the Dark World's army, those forces weren't worth mentioning. Not even an army of tens of thousands would be a warm-up for these 6,000-plus Tier 3 experts. If this force entered the Dark Den, they could sweep through the Otherworld without any trouble. Even if every shelter banded together, they wouldn't survive. Meanwhile, Zero Wing had fewer than 500 Tier 3 experts present, and even with monsters like Fire Dance and Hell Rush, their chances of victory were unknown. I don't know, but even if we lose this battle, it'll be helpful in the future. Not just anyone gets an opportunity to face such a powerful force. Blue Frost replied with a bitter smile. He had to admit that while Shifeng's behavior was insane, his blood boiled with excitement. After all, who at this stage of the game would dare challenge such a formidable army? Even the main continent's various superpowers were afraid of the Dark World's invading army, but not Zero Wing. If they lost, they'd lose with their pride intact. This was also a super rare opportunity to clash with a large number of Tier 3 experts, and the experience would definitely bolster their future development. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. As soon as Blue Frost finished his reply, however, Shifeng stepped forward from Zero Wing's defensive circle and faced the Dark World's several thousand Tier 3 experts directly. It seems you still don't understand, Shifeng said, shaking his head at the Tier 3 dark players around him. Calmly he continued. Since the very beginning, I told you that I've only come to inform you. I'm not here to negotiate. Since you wish to test my patience, I regret to inform you that you've picked a fight with the wrong person. Shifeng then pulled a token from his bag and started to chant an incantation. It was simple, only consisting of a dozen or so syllables, and would even be easy for a player new to God's domain to chant. Before the dark players could mock Shifeng for his ignorant foolishness, several magic arrays quickly manifested behind the swordsman. In less than a second, they transformed into a spatial gate, and once the gate was complete, NPCs in exquisite, uniform equipment marched into Cold Spring Forest like a well-trained army. Every one of these NPCs had at least reached level 120 and Tier 3. Many of them even hailed from other races. And in the blink of an eye, more than 1,000 NPCs had joined the battlefield. Chapter 2563. Suppressing everyone. Crazy Zero Wing. When more than 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs appeared behind Shifeng, the Dark players, Zero Wing's members, and the Hell Legion were stunned. In the various NPC kingdoms and empires, Tier 3 NPCs were considered powerhouses. They could even serve as magistrates in minor cities. And yet, Shifeng had just summoned over 1,000 of these NPCs, including non-human NPCs. It was unbelievable. We already have so many? When Gentle Snow saw Shifeng's night division, surprise colored her features. She had known for a while that Shifeng had invested a ton of coins in developing the guild's night division, but she had assumed they'd need a long time to amass and nurture so many Tier 3 NPCs. During Shifeng's visit to the Western continent, she had felt they'd be lucky enough to gain an additional 200 or 300 Tier 3 knights, but contrary to her expectations, they had several times that. With this many Tier 3 knights, not even taking out an army of more than 10,000 Tier 3 players would be a problem, much less defeating the 6,000 Tier 3 dark players before them. The reason was very simple. Not only were NPCs' basic attributes far higher than players of the same level and tier, but they also commanded a large number of skills and spells. Their skill and spell completion rates also triumphed over players. Moreover, as God's domain underwent more system updates, NPCs' intellect and combat standards would improve. At Tier 3, NPCs could already more or less rival Refinement Realm experts, with some surpassing them. This was why even Tier 3 players would receive a one-sided beating if they challenged Tier 3 NPCs. Of course, the biggest difference between the two was NPCs' equipment standards. Acquiring level 100 plus fine gold weapons and equipment was currently incredibly difficult for players, but even the weakest of God's domain's Tier 3 NPCs, at least those not bound to players, wore full sets of dark gold equipment. Most of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights, on the other hand, wore epic equipment. Even Tier 3 Void Realm experts would have to flee from these knights, let alone Tier 3 Refinement Realm experts. The surrounding 6,000 plus Tier 3 dark players unconsciously began to retreat. The major powers' upper echelons watched on with grim expressions, astonished. None of them had ever thought Zero Wing's strength would be this frightening. When they had learned, throughout their investigations, that Zero Wing had nearly 600 Tier 3 knights, the prospect of dealing with the guild had given them huge headaches. If they wanted to capture Stone Forest City, They knew they'd have to work with the main continent's various superpowers. But not only had they just learned that Zero Wing had 5 Crimson Dragon flying ships, but it also had more than twice the reported Tier 3 knights. Just how were they supposed to fight such a force? Is this why he hadn't hesitated to give away 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource spots? Realization dawned on Blue Rainbow as she watched Sherfong. She had thought the man was insane for giving up so much of Cold Spring Forest and increasing the competition between his guild and the Dark World's various powers, but looking at it now, it seemed she had been sorely mistaken. With so much combat power, no power or player in the Dark World would dare compete with Zero Wing for the remaining 30% of Cold Spring Forest. On the contrary, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society would have a much harder time controlling their 70%. Most of the two guilds' influence lay in the Dark World, and outside of it, they had barely any at all. If the Dark World's players were too afraid to take a bite out of Zero Wing's resource spots, it would only be natural that they'd contest with Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's territory instead. Damn it! How is this possible? Furious Heart felt as if he were going mad as he gazed at the 1,000+ Tier 3 NPCs behind Sherfong. He couldn't fathom how Zero Wing had gotten its hand on so many, and every one wore excellent equipment too. Against such a force, not even an army of more than 10,000 Tier 3 experts would have an advantage. Moreover, the Tier 3 experts that had joined the invading army belonged to the various guilds and adventurer teams. Commanding them like a proper army would prove very difficult. No one wanted to serve as cannon fodder and die a pointless death. If the invading army had had an absolute advantage, overwhelming Zero Wing's experts with their numbers would have been easy. But now that there was such a radical difference between the two sides' strength, the various guilds and adventurer teams' Tier 3 experts wouldn't be so keen to take action. The 1,000+ NPCs waiting for orders petrified the Dark World's players. They simply stared at Sherfong and his NPCs in silence, stupefying Blue Frost's group. Even the Hell Legion's members were astonished. Before coming here, they had accepted their impending deaths. They had been massively outnumbered after all. Even if they were more powerful individually, they wouldn't be able to kill enough players with their limited stamina and concentration. However, none of them had imagined that the situation would develop as it had. The army of several million, which had boldly marched into Cold Spring Forest, had come to a grinding halt, and none of the Dark World's players dared to step forward. Everyone stood frozen in front of the teleportation gate. After the silence had dragged on for a while, Dawn Dominance emerged from the crowd, presenting himself before Sherfong once more. This time, however, the man didn't look down on Sherfong. Rather, he appeared cautious. Guild leader Black Flame, you truly are amazing. It's no wonder how you established Stone Forest City in Cold Spring Forest, Dawn Dominance said, applauding Sherfong in admiration. Since everyone here has recognized your display of strength, on behalf of the Dark World's various guilds and adventurer teams, I will declare that we will not participate in Zero Wing's struggle against the various superpowers. Do you find this arrangement agreeable, Guild leader Black Flame? While Dawn Dominance spoke, the various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons nodded in agreement. If Zero Wing had proven as weak as they had expected, they wouldn't have had a problem, but now that they saw how mighty the guild was, they wouldn't fight it. Even if they worked with the main continent's various superpowers, capturing Stone Forest City was impossible. They'd only incur unnecessary losses if they faced Zero Wing in battle. Dawn Dominance, how can you do this? Furious Heart bellowed, enraged, when he heard Dawn Dominance surrender to Zero Wing. To goad the Dark World's various powers into attacking Zero Wing, Demon's Heart had offered world domination a plethora of benefits. However, now that the situation had turned south, Dawn Dominance had decided to give up. With world domination leading the Dark World's surrender, the other world's other powers wouldn't target Zero Wing, either. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. Before Furious Heart could continue to curse at Dawn Dominance, however, Sherfong shook his head. Guild leader Dawn, how many times must I repeat myself before you get it through your head? I am only here to notify you that Zero Wing will be managing the Dark World's teleportation gate from now on. And in the future, my guild will collect a fee from anyone that wishes to use it. Have I been specific enough now? Shifeng asked the other guild leader. I don't care if you wish to work with those superpowers against Stone Forest City or not. Dawn Dominance, who had intended to say more, was speechless. Even Furious Heart, who had been angrily cursing in the distance, gaped at Shifeng. Is this guy insane? Dawn Dominance has already declared that none of us would target Stone Forest City, yet he insists on managing the teleportation gate. Does he really want to make the entire dark world his enemy? When Magic Flash heard Shifeng's response, he too was at a loss for words. This was the best outcome Zero Wing could hope for, but rather than settling, Shifeng insisted on owning the dark world's teleportation gate. He was a madman. Chapter 2564 Crazy? Night Division take action. Does he really plan to start a war with the entire dark world? Even Furious Heart, who wanted nothing more than Zero Wing and Shifeng's annihilation, was confused by the swordsman's actions. He even wondered if he had misheard the man. Instead of settling for a peaceful outcome, Shifeng continued to insist that he'd wrestle for control over the dark world's teleportation gate. Even if they banded together, the various superpowers wouldn't dare threaten such a thing. In fact, they hadn't even harbored the thought. The teleportation gate was basically the otherworld player's lifeline, and if a foreign power took control of the gate, all of the dark world's residents would be subjected to that power's whims. These dark players simply wouldn't allow such an outcome. They'd fight anyone who threatened to control the teleportation gate to the death. This was why neither Demon's Heart nor the various superpowers had considered doing so. If they tried, not only would they fail, but they'd also throw their lives away in the attempt to control the teleportation gate. And yet, Shifeng didn't just consider it an option. He fully intended to succeed. As Shifeng finished speaking, the dark players around him erupted in an uproar. Is Black Flame insane? He's trying to take control of our world's lifeline. We're already giving up so much by surrendering in the fight for Stone Forest City. Yet Black Flame wants a mile after we've given him an inch. Does he really doubt that we'll attack Zero Wing? The fear the dark world's various major powers and independent players had felt a moment ago vanished. Now only fury flashed in their eyes. They all wanted nothing more than to show Shifeng the consequences for his ignorance. The dark world players began to close in on Zero Wing's guild leader. Their Tier 3 experts, who had decided to avoid a fight moments ago, were now more than eager to teach the swordsman a lesson. 7,000, 9,000, 10,000. In less than a minute, more than 20,000 Tier 3 experts had surrounded Shifeng. Every one of them glared, radiating rage and killing intent. The guild leader's not serious, right? Evening Lotus worriedly asked from beside Blue Frost as she watched more Tier 3 experts gather around them. With the combined strength of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights, Tier 3 experts, and the Crimson Dragon flying ship, they could at most take on 10,000 Tier 3 experts at a time. Any more, and their risk of dying increased substantially. If they had to face all of the Dark World's Tier 3 experts, they'd be finished. Here they didn't have the protection of Stone Forest City. Moreover, NPCs were far more troublesome to resurrect than players. Generally, the various powers only used their NPCSW as a deterrent, and avoided sending them into battle unless absolutely necessary. Are you serious, Guild Leader Black Flame? Dawn Dominance asked after taking a deep breath, a cold glint flashing in his eyes. While he could ignore the struggle for Stone Forest City, he couldn't ignore Shifeng's declaration to control the teleportation gate, as it involved his guild's continued development. Of course, Shifeng confidently replied. He hadn't actually considered taking control of the Dark World's teleportation gate before today, but times had changed. He had developed his night division far faster than expected, and it was now far stronger than it appeared. Shifeng wouldn't have been able to do anything about the situation if the teleportation gate had opened anywhere else. Since it had opened in Cold Spring Forest, where his night division was based, however, he'd be a fool not to take advantage of it. Due to the Dark World's nature, regular powers and players had an incredibly difficult time establishing themselves in the otherworld. Not even the various super guilds were guaranteed success. Yet, as luck would have it, the Dark World offered an extraordinary amount of attributed resources, And because of this, the various superpowers of his past had done everything in their power to ally with the Dark World's various powers. However, even after paying astronomical sums, those superpowers had only acquired a small number of attributed resources to use in crafting weapons and equipment. If he were to let this opportunity slip through his fingers, he wouldn't likely find another. Good. It seems you've steeled yourself to make the Dark World your enemy, Guild Leader Black Flame. Dawn Dominance said and smiled. Since that is the case, show us what profound move you'll use to stop us. Dawn Dominance's head had begun to ache over surrendering his share of Stone Forest City's benefits. A few thousand Tier 3 experts were certainly no match for Zero Wing's current combat power. He'd need the Dark World's entire strength. Normally, however, persuading his homeworld's major powers and independent powers to dedicate themselves to what was essentially a suicide mission would be impossible. Fortunately, Shifeng had just given him the opening to succeed with an extremely persuasive bargaining chip. The Dark World's very future. This would be more than enough of a reason for the Dark World's masses to combine their strength. Even if Shifeng's group fell back to Stone Forest City, they wouldn't be able to stop the other world's forces. Why are you still wasting time with him, Guild Leader Dawn? That's right. He only has a little over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs. Even if we die and lose a level, we can recover quickly and rejoin the fight. On the other hand, those NPCs will be gone for good once they're dead. Let's see if Black Flame keeps acting so arrogantly once we've gotten rid of his NPCs. The various powers experts and independent players riled themselves up and charged at Shifeng's group the moment Dawn Dominance finished speaking. Over 20,000 Tier 3 experts and several 100,000 Tier 2 players advanced, their footfalls shaking the entire valley. Despite their bountiful combat experience, the Hell Legion's members grew nervous, watching the incoming force with grim expressions. This battle would be more terrifying than any they had participated in. The Dark World's various powers didn't even prepare any of their trump cards. Relying solely on their numbers, the invading army could intimidate even God's domain's various superpowers. Moreover, some of the Dark players used Tier 3 defensive magic scrolls to cope with potential Tier 4 attacks. This greatly limited how effective the flying ships could be in this fight. Die. So what if you have over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs and 5 flying ships? None of them can reach their full potential in such a vast plain. Furious Heart excitedly shouted as he watched the Dark players swarm toward Shifeng. Every Dark player participating in the army was an expert. They had long since familiarized themselves with large-scale combat and knew how to minimize the damage enemy AoE attacks could deal. Furthermore, unlike in a siege, Zero Wing's forces didn't have a defensive magic array to hide behind. Once the two armies engaged, war weapons like the Crimson Dragon flying ships and large-scale destruction spells would be nearly useless. However, Shifeng didn't mobilize his flying ships or instruct his Tier 3 magical class NPCs to cast large-scale destruction spells as everyone had expected. He simply watched the Dark players approach in silence. Have they forgotten how to attack, scared silly? They must not have expected an actual fight, but it's too late for regret now. The Dark players were confused when Zero Wing's forces remained motionless, but that didn't stop them in closing the distance. 100 yards. 50 yards. 30 yards. Fools. When less than 30 yards separated Shifeng's forces from the Dark players, he swung a hand forward and shouted, "Attack!" Suddenly, over 100 tall, brawny oars geared with epic weapons and equipment exploded forth, reaching the enemy's front line in the blink of an eye. They brandished their swords and axes, cutting down the enemy Tier 3 MTs with speed and accuracy. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU skillfully responding to the Or Knight's assault. The Tier 3 MTs raised their shields, effectively blocking the attacks. After a moment, however, every Dark player was stupefied. The instant the Or's weapons slammed into the Tier 3 MT's shields, every player that took a hit flew backward as if a giant boulder had slammed into them. From afar, it had looked like the Dark World's army had crashed into an immovable wall. Not only had the army's advance ended in a grinding halt, but bodies flew above the rest of the force as well. Before these players fell to the ground, however, countless magic arrays appeared above, bombarding them with another series of attacks. The casters exhibited astounding control with their spells, and the spells themselves were unbelievably powerful. Every attack had as much power as level 110 mythic monsters. Despite their defensive spells' protection, the targeted players lost every last HP in no time at all. Over 1,000 Tier 3 players and several Tier 3 players had died in less than a second, leaving nothing but empty space among the tide of dark players. The Dark World's denizens hadn't even had a chance to retaliate. Chapter 2565, Frightening Night Division, True Despair? Less than 10 seconds after the battle had begun, the Dark players' confidence shattered. The MTs on the front line were bona fide Tier 3 players, and many of them were well-known experts in the Dark World. They had so much HP and defense that they could stand there unfazed, as other Tier 3 experts wailed on them. And yet, these same Tier 3 MTs were dying too quickly for the rear line's healers to restore their HPs. They had lost their lives without any chance to retaliate. For a moment, everyone watching wondered if those MTs had deliberately worn bronze equipment into battle. Their opponents were only level 120 plus, Tier 3 NPCs, and many of the Dark World's players had fought NPC cities Tier 3 soldiers before. Although Tier 3 NPCs might have higher basic attributes and combat standards, the difference shouldn't be this massive. Even Zero Wings players were stunned. The Tier 3 knights had slain over 1,000 Tier 3 players and several thousand Tier 2 players with a single round of attacks. Such a force would even give super guilds a painful headache, and putting an end to the battle would take quite a while. However, those Tier 2 and 3 dark players were little more than infants before the Tier 3 knights. The two sides' combat power was on entirely different levels. Only Shifeng remained unperturbed. His Tier 3 knights only seemed to be 10 or so levels higher than the enemy's Tier 3 players on the surface. Logically, there shouldn't be such a huge gap between the two forces' strength, even if the Tier 3 knights were fully armed with epic weapons and equipment. However, God's Domain's current players didn't know that there were significant differences among NPCs' combat power, even at Tier 3. One of the most obvious was the liberation of their mana bodies. Unlike players, NPCs did not need to invest a large amount of time to unlock their mana body's potential after reaching Tier 3. Instead, they relied on their talent and growth potential. As long as Tier 3 NPCs had the required talent and growth potential, they could unlock their mana bodies immediately. Conversely, some failed to accomplish the feat throughout their lifetimes. The applicants Shifeng had accepted into his Knight division were considered elites among NPCs. Their innate talent and growth potential were far superior to the soldiers in NPC cities. Hence, as soon as they reached Tier 3, they had unlocked their mana body's full potential. They hadn't needed to experiment as players did. But what about God's Domain's current players? Most hadn't even started the process of unlocking their mana bodies, let alone unlock them fully. They were 10 years too early if they thought they could stand against Shifeng's Knight division. Moreover, Shifeng had employed plenty of ores, elves and giants. Their combat power was even greater than human NPCs of the same tier and level. For example, a mysterious iron-ranked or warrior could rival a secret silver-ranked human warrior. Of the non-human members of Shifeng's Knight division, even the weakest had mysterious iron growth potential. Not even Tier 3 peak experts in full, top-tier equipment would last more than a few seconds against these NPCs, much less ordinary Tier 3 experts. Before the Dark World's players could snap out of their daze, Zero Wings Knights swept through them again. Like harvesting wheat, the Knights needed no more than 3 moves to slay the Dark players, reaping their lives in the blink of an eye. None had time for elegant or astonishing combat techniques on this battlefield. Only pure strength and terror reigned. The first unit, consisting of more than 50,000 players, had been annihilated in less than 2 minutes, and over 6,000 of them had been Tier 3 experts. In contrast, Zero Wing hadn't lost a single knight. In fact, they had hardly taken any damage. Silence descended on the battlefield. The dark players that had eagerly charged into combat had begun to back away, one step after another. How is this possible? Furious Heart, who had been preparing to join the fray, gasped when he saw the field of corpses. He had assumed the Dark World's overwhelming victory had been assured, He had never expected the battle to end like this. They were talking about more than 6,000 Tier 3 experts. The horrific force could easily destroy a guild city. Yet before Zero Wing's Night Division, those experts had been as weak as common monsters. How do they have so much more combat power? Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold, who watched from afar, were just as shocked after watching the Knights obliterate the first wave of players. They had thought Shifeng's confidence had been a joke. They had never dreamed that his guild was actually this strong. When Zero Wing had refrained from using its flying ships, they had seen the decision as foolish. Looking at it now, however, that was not the case. Zero Wing had merely decided against using the ships because it didn't need them. How could these 1,000 plus NPCs even be Tier 3 beings? They seemed more like Tier 4 mythic monsters, and ones with incredibly high combat standards. If the Dark World wanted to defeat such a frightening force, it would have to rely on its foundations. Otherwise, it didn't matter how many players they sent at those Tier 3 NPCs. All would perish. How are these Tier 3 NPCs so strong? Dawn Dominance frowned after watching several thousand Tier 3 experts die. Gritting his teeth, he snarled. Everyone, now is not the time to hold back. All guilds and adventurer teams, use your trump cards and crush those NPCs. If we keep holding back, Zero Wing will take the teleportation gate. The various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons immediately took action. Zero Wing's Night Division might be scary, but their members were no pushovers. Like Zero Wing, they had trump cards that could boost their combat power far above what they currently wielded. One after another, the guilds and adventurer teams activated their trump cards. Tier 4 Summoning Scrolls, Advanced Magic Barriers, Tier 3 Personal Guards. In less than a minute, more than 50 Tier 4 summon creatures and 4,000 Tier 3 personal guards appeared on the battlefield, their combined aura making everyone in the vicinity shudder. The various superpowers members watching the battle from a safe distance were especially flabbergasted. The Dark World's guilds and adventurer teams had just revealed their strength in its fullest. Amazing! Truly amazing! No individual power can hope to stand against the Dark World. Furious Heart's heart pounded as he watched. He had been shocked to see Zero Wing field over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs, but that was nothing before the Dark World's full power. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU excellent. Everyone attack. Dawn Dominance proudly ordered. Annihilate Zero Wing and avenge our fallen brothers. As soon as they heard the command, the various guilds and adventurer teams sent their Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 summon creatures into battle. Not even they had thought their combined strength would be so terrifying. Zero Wing's players began to panic a little. Now the tides had turned. But just as the Dark World's residents expected to see Shifeng fall into despair, the person in question gazed upon the approaching NPC force and summoned creatures with an extraordinary calm before retrieving a small ring from his bag. Miniature World. Chapter 2566. Mouths. Ajar, seeing Shifeng step forward and chant an incantation, Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold were stunned. He still wants to fight? Confusion changed Blue Rainbow's expression when Shifeng showed no intention of retreating. The difference between their combat power was clear for all to see. The Dark World's invading army was far too strong for any individual power to stop. Based on Shifeng's behavior, however, he intended to stay in this fight. Blue Rainbow struggled to understand. During its investigations, Dark Rhapsody had obtained quite a bit of detailed information on Zero Wing from the main continent's superpowers, and knew the guild had a plethora of astounding trump cards. The Ring of Gospel, a domain treasure, was one of them. When activated on a large battlefield, it had proven miraculously effective. Not only did the Ring of Gospel have large AoE skills, but they were also considerably powerful. However, the ring's effects on this battlefield would be very limited. Zero Wing currently faced Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summon creatures. After all, they had incredible resistance to suppression effects. Moreover, more than 50 Tier 4 summon creatures had joined the fight. Even if the Ring of Gospel could suppress them, a measly 1,000 plus Tier 3 NPCs wouldn't be enough to stop them. The invading army also had over 3,000 Tier 3 personal guards to support it. Even Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa, who watched from a hidden location, were confused. What is Black Flame trying to do? Is he going for broke? They had only come to get a glimpse of the Dark World's strength. They had never dreamed that they'd witness a large-scale war between Zero Wing and the other world. They had been unprecedentedly shocked after seeing Zero Wing's combat power. No one had expected the guild to have the strength to stand up to a force that included every expert from an entire other world. Moreover, Zero Wing had even successfully deterred the Dark World's experts. The guild's strength was unbelievable. When they recalled the relatively amicable relationship between their Extreme Light Shelter and Shelter 1, they breathed a sigh of relief. If Zero Wing wanted to, its night division alone was more than capable of flattening the entire Dark Denver. On the other hand, Zero Wing's current opponents were bona fide Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 mythic monsters. With such a large difference between the two sides' combat power and numbers, retreating to Stone Forest City was the wisest move Zero Wing could make. Every one of those Tier 3 knights was a part of Zero Wing's foundations, and if they were slain, Zero Wing would be crippled. Zero Wing had already proven its strength. Once news of this battle spread, the various superpowers that wanted to capture Stone Forest City would back down. The Dark World's players and powers wouldn't underestimate Zero Wing again. In fact, they might even avoid offending the guild's members in Cold Spring Forest. While Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa were fraught with confusion, something suddenly changed above the valley. A phantom world gradually descended, growing as it grew closer to the valley floor. In less than 3 seconds, not only had the phantom world grown large enough to cover the battlefield, but it also enveloped the spectating players, including Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa, in the distance. The instant they felt the phantom world's power, both Graceful Moon and Purple Rakshasa felt out of tune with the world around them. It felt like they had become enemies with their surroundings. Not only had their physiques started to weaken, but they also lost a significant portion of their basic attributes. The Phantom World's power also seemed to affect the Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summon creatures. They had slowed considerably, and their auras even seemed significantly weaker. What did he do? Blue Rainbow gaped, shocked when she realized how much the Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 monsters had been suppressed. She had experienced domain's effects before, which tended to be much weaker than magic barriers. The stronger the target was, the less the domain would suppress it. Yet Shifeng's domain had destroyed everything she thought she knew about the mechanic. Normally, not even intermediate magic arrays could suppress Tier 4 monsters to this extent, but within Shifeng's domain, their auras had weakened considerably. This domain could practically rival advanced magic barriers, and it was so massive that it covered the entire valley. She had never heard of such a powerful domain. Before anyone could react, however, Shifeng began another incantation. Ring of Brilliance. When he finished his chant, a light rippled across the battlefield, stunning every dark player in the area. Crap. This is cheating. Magic Flash cursed aloud, glaring at Zero Wing's night division. The intensity of those knights' auras had skyrocketed, and the combined energy made them feel as if they were truly a legion of Tier 4 monsters. The knights' mental states had also visibly improved. They looked nothing like they had a few moments ago. The sudden development caused an uproar among the various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons, who commanded the Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summoned creatures, and they halted their advance, exchanging looks. A deathly silence had fallen over the Dark World's invading army, and the passion and killing intent they had radiated was nowhere to be seen. Do you wish to continue this fight? Shifeng calmly asked after sweeping his gaze over the dark players before him. This time, not one dark player dared to speak up. They simply stared back with angry, reluctant looks. Fight. More like suicide. Determined, they had revealed every trump card they had previously hidden. And yet, thanks to the Ring of Gospel's 2 skills, they hadn't even shortened the gap between their strength and Zero Wings. Rather, it had only grown. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Since no one responded to his question, Shifeng turned to Dawn Dominance, who still succumbed to his shock. Guild Leader Dawn, since you can speak on behalf of the Dark World, may I know if you wish to continue this battle? Shifeng asked, smiling at the robust man. Dawn Dominance's countenance turned ashen when he heard the question, and he was at a complete loss for words. If he chose to fight, he'd be sacrificing himself and his guild to oblivion. He had dispatched every Tier 3 personal guard world domination owned for the sake of driving the other guilds and adventurer teams into action. If just one of those NPCs died, his guild would suffer a huge blow. If they all died, world domination wouldn't survive. However, nothing would remain of world domination's hard-won prestige in the Dark World if he admitted defeat. Chapter 2567. Suppressing an army of millions. Upon hearing the question Shifeng directed at Dawn Dominance, silence fell over the battlefield as the various powers' upper echelons turned to look at World Domination's guild leader, who served as the Dark World's representative. Zero Wing's strength had far exceeded their expectations. The guild possessed not only an incredibly strong knight division, but also a domain treasure capable of significantly suppressing even Tier 4 creatures. The combination of the two cards meant no power could threaten Zero Wing's Knight Legion at this stage of the game. For a time, silence reigned over the Dark World's army of several millions because of Shifeng's words. This situation stupefied Magic Flash and the others, who were spectating the battle from afar. Arrogance? Ignorance? When Magic Flash and the others thought back to the opinions they had of Shifeng, they realized how ridiculous those were. At the same time, they celebrated inwardly. This was because they finally saw for themselves what a true monster was today. Previously, in their opinion, single-handedly going up against thousands of enemies simultaneously could already be considered a legendary feat. In fact, 99% of the people who claimed to be capable of such a feat were undoubtedly spouting nonsense. As expert players, Magic Flash and his companions knew just how difficult it was to go up against thousands of enemies simultaneously, especially in a large-scale guild war. The enemy side would definitely have numerous expert players amidst their forces. Trying to fight against thousands in such a situation ramped up the difficulty. Now, however, not only did this legendary feat happen right before their very eyes, but the scale of this feat had even been magnified by 1,000. Shifeng had single-handedly suppressed an army of millions. Due to just this one scene, they could say with certainty that the name of Black Flame would shake the entire Dark World in the future. Is he really human? Purple Rakshas's heart pounded rapidly as she took in the army of millions remaining motionless before Shifeng. At this moment, she earnestly doubted Shifeng was human. He had intimidated several million expert players and several thousand Tier 3 NPCs. Although Shifeng's previous performance at the Extreme Light Shelter had already been plenty shocking, that feat was nothing compared to this. Even standing a great distance away, she had still shuddered upon sighting the army of millions. Shifeng, however, had single-handedly silenced these several million experts. The power and influence he wielded were simply inhuman. It seems Shelter 1 no longer has to worry about its development from now on, Graceful Monarch said, a bitter smile forming on her face as she gazed at Blue Frost, one of her rivals in the Dark Denver. Originally, Graceful Monarch thought that, with Crimson Emperor's help, the Extreme Light Shelter could surpass Shelter 1 in the Dark Denver. In light of the turn of events, however, that was categorically impossible. Zero Wing was a guild capable of suppressing an entire world's players to the point where they didn't even dare to breathe. Once news of this feat reached the Dark Den, the experts that revered strength would definitely do everything they could to join Shelter 1 and Zero Wing. Moreover, Shifeng had previously displayed extraordinary individual strength in the Dark Denver. With these two factors combined, Shelter 1 would surely become a sacred land for Dark Den's experts. After the silence on the battlefield persisted for some time, Dawn Dominance walked up to Shifeng with an incomparably gloomy expression. The pride and fighting spirit he had before were nowhere to be seen now. Guild leader Black Flame, this move of yours is indeed amazing. I'm afraid nobody ever thought that Zero Wing might actually possess so much hidden strength, Dawn Dominance said after taking a deep breath. However, it is wise not to bum one's bridges. I admit that the domain skills you used are very powerful. However, these domain skills will only remain active so long as their user is alive. Once the user dies, the effects of the domain skills will disappear. The Dark World's army might not be a match for your army, but we have plenty of people. We have more than enough manpower to spare to kill you. The user of the domain skills. Of course, I also have to admit that we will suffer plenty of losses before we succeed. However, the final outcome is similarly one that you will not wish to see, Guild Leader Black Flame. Instead of suffering mutual destruction, why don't we each take a step back? Our request is very simple. So long as Zero Wing stops having designs on the teleportation gate, everything else is negotiable. Upon hearing Dawn Dominance's suggestion, realization immediately dawned upon the dark players present. Guild Leader Dawn really is the best. How could we have forgotten such a thing? Due to the immense shock they felt before, one simple thing actually slipped their minds. In God's domain, magic arrays and domain skills required a user to sustain them. Domain tools were no exception. If they killed the player using the tool, then the tool would naturally lose effect. Meanwhile, once the Dark Army no longer suffered under the effects of Miniature World, taking care of Zero Wing would be a piece of cake. However, Dawn Dominance was also correct in that they would have to pay a huge price to annihilate Zero Wing if they continued fighting, and this was not something they wished to see. The best solution now was for both sides to each take a step back. What if I refuse? Shifeng asked, smiling. At Shifeng's words, silence filled the battlefield once more. Lunatic. He's definitely a lunatic. The Dark World has already taken a step back, yet he's still insisting on controlling the teleportation gate. Is he really not afraid of losing everything? The spectating experts of the various superpowers found Shifeng's intransigence insane. Previously, the Dark Worlds offered to give up on participating in the superpowers' fight for Stone Forest City was already plenty shocking. Now, the Dark World was even willing to take another step back and provide Zero Wing with other benefits in exchange for Zero Wing giving up its designs on the teleportation gate. In the eyes of the main continent's various superpowers, this was an unbelievable opportunity. Something any power would wish to obtain. Yet Shifeng had still rejected it without hesitation. They had no doubt that this was the Dark World's bottom line. There would be no more concessions after this. If Shifeng continued insisting on taking control of the teleportation gate, then Zero Wing really would enter an irreconcilable feud with the Dark World. Guild Leader Black Flame, do you really intend to drag Zero Wing into a fight to the death? Dawn Dominance demanded as he tried to suppress the anger in his heart as much as possible. You'll regret it if that happens. Zero Wing's strength thoroughly exceeded Dawn Dominance's expectations. If both sides continued fighting, the only outcome would be mutual destruction, an outcome he was not willing to see. After all, world domination still needed to develop on the main continent. Without sufficient strength, its efforts would be futile. However, he never imagined that Shifeng would actually be so stubborn as to refuse to take a step back even when given an excellent opportunity to do so. Guild Leader Dawn, there's no need to continue showing Black Flame any respect. Since he doesn't know how to appreciate goodwill, I say that we just teach him a lesson. At worst, we'll have a slower time developing on the main continent. That's right. Since he doesn't want the goodwill we're showing him, let's just annihilate Zero Wing and be done with this. Let's see what he can do then. The dark players present similarly grew enraged at Shifeng's response. They had already offered a huge concession to Zero Wing, a condition that even super guilds wouldn't dream of obtaining, yet Shifeng had still chosen to reject it. This rekindled the various powers' thoughts of annihilating Zero Wing. A fight to the death. Shaking his head, Shifeng said, Guild Leader Dawn, you're over-exaggerating things. In my eyes it is at most negligible losses. Good. Since you wish to remain stubborn, you have only yourself to blame, Guild Leader Black Flame. Brothers, no need to hold back anymore. Dawn Dominance snarled as he glared at Shifeng in anger. Negligible losses? Such arrogance. Shifeng was simply too arrogant. However, just as the Dark World's army was about to advance once more, Shifeng made his move. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Unsheathing Killing Ray, Shifeng executed a forward slash. Lightning slash. A blue lightning bolt promptly streaked through the area before Shifeng. A bystander would also see a pitch-black spatial tear following closely behind the lightning bolt. Without Dawn Dominance noticing, both the lightning bolt and spatial tear brushed past his body. When the lightning bolt disappeared, the dozen or so Tier 3 experts in its path instantly lost all their HPs. An 18-meter-tall, level 115 mythic monster standing a short distance behind Dawn Dominance was also sent flying and crashing into a bunch of dark players. For a time, deathly silence filled the battlefield. Chapter 2568, Dark World defeated. Zero Wing flourishes. After a short period of stunned silence, a gabble of confusion erupted as everyone present stared at Shifeng in disbelief. What happened? How did he send a Tier 4 summoned creature flying? What did he do? Everyone present had seen Shifeng's actions very clearly. In fact, they even felt that Shifeng had moved very slowly. However, nobody could wrap their heads around what had actually happened. All they had seen was Shifeng executing a forward slash at the empty space before him, and releasing a streak of blue light from his sword. And by the time they snapped out of their daze, the Tier 4 summoned creature that stood over 60 yards away from the swordsman was already in the air. He sent a level 115, Tier 4 summoned creature flying with a single hit. Blue Rainbow wore a somber and confused look on her face as she gazed at Shifeng. Just how high are his basic attributes? From previous investigations, she knew that Shifeng possessed ridiculously high basic attributes. Even Rebellious Thunder, who was a demon count and wielded the magic weapon Cruel Darkness, had only a slight edge on Shifeng in this regard. Moreover, that was when Shifeng was in his normal state. In other words, even back then, Shifeng's strength attribute should already rival that of mythic monsters of the same level. Now, however, Shifeng had actually sent a level 115 mythic monster flying with his attack. Something was wrong with this situation. After all, blocking an attack from a mythic monster and sending a mythic monster flying were two entirely different concepts. Unless there was an enormous gap in strength, it was impossible for one to send their opponents flying. Yet not only did Shifeng send a mythic monster flying, but it was even a level 115 mythic monster. The current strength he displayed was starkly different from what the reports mentioned. How is this possible? Furious Heart, who was spectating from afar, was similarly stunned by this situation. He had personally witnessed Shifeng's strength before. However, despite so little time having passed since their last meeting, Shifeng could now actually send a level 115 mythic monster flying with his attacks. For a moment, Furious Heart suspected that the main god system was playing a prank on him. With such frightening strength, let alone Tier 3 NPCs, even Tier 4 NPCs would struggle to deal with Shifeng. Needless to say, it would be a fool's dream to hope that a bunch of Tier 4 mythic monsters would defeat him. Monsters generally had very low combat standards. In a situation where the difference in basic attributes was negligible, they would be no different from common monsters in front of even ordinary expert players, let alone a domain realm expert like Shifeng. If all 50+ Tier 4 summoned creatures attacked the swordsman, they would still have an incredibly difficult time inflicting damage on him. Not to mention, Shifeng still had a legion of Tier 3 knights behind him. How did he get so strong? Hellrush, who stood among Zero Wing's forces, was similarly astounded as he looked at Shifeng. Ever since Netherworld Empire had partnered with Zero Wing, Hellrush had been following beside Shifeng almost every day. Hence, he had a very good understanding of Shifeng's strength. Moreover, Shifeng had spent much less time grinding than Hellrush. In fact, Hellrush had rarely ever seen Shifeng going out to grind for levels, as the man was tied down by all sorts of guild affairs. In contrast, Hellrush had been frantically grinding every day. And thanks to Stone Forest City's help, not only was he close to reaching level 110 already, but he had even replaced 2 pieces of his equipment thus far. He had also achieved considerable progress in unlocking his mana body. Personally, he deemed that the gap in combat power between himself and Shifeng should have shrunk by quite a bit. However, contrary to Hellrush's belief, not only had the gap in combat power not shrunk, but it had actually grown instead. As for Dawn Dominance, who originally planned to ridicule Shifeng for his arrogance and ignorance, He was stunned by this unexpected development as well. When he saw the Tier 4 summoned creature sprawled on the ground, his mind froze momentarily. Dawn Dominance had known that Shifeng possessed basic attributes rivaling those of mythic monsters, and that the man was considered a peerless monster in God's domain. The swordsman definitely wasn't an existence that ordinary experts could hope to contend with. Even a group of Tier 3 peak experts wouldn't be his match. However, what was up with the current situation? How was Shifeng just a peerless monster? He was much stronger than even Zero Wing's nigh invincible Tier 3 knights. In fact, killing several hundred of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights would be much easier than killing Shifeng. At this moment, only Shifeng himself remained unfazed by the latest development. In God's domain, weapons played the biggest role in determining a player's combat power. The Abyssal Blade's recent promotion into a fragmented legendary weapon had boosted Shifeng's strength beyond that of level 115 mythic monsters. With the Ring of Gospel's assistance, which weakened the Dark Army's Tier 4 summoned creatures and improved his own basic attributes by a significant margin, it was only natural that he could send a level 115 mythic monster flying. Guild Leader Dawn, do you still wish to continue? Shifeng asked the motionless man before him. This time, Shifeng did not speak that loudly. However, the dark players found his voice unusually ear-piercing and vexing. This was already Shifeng's second time asking them this question. It was as if he was ridiculing them for their previous mockery of him, and they could not help but wish they could charge forward and kill Shifeng right now. Humiliation. This was absolute humiliation. Nevertheless, despite feeling greatly humiliated, none of the dark players present dared to speak up. Instead, they all stared at Dawn Dominance in silence. Meanwhile, after Shifeng repeated his question, an indescribably gloomy expression appeared on Dawn Dominance's face. Black flame. Dawn Dominance gnashed his teeth as he glared at Shifeng. However, aside from calling out Shifeng's name, he couldn't think of anything else to say. In this situation, the upper echelons of the Dark World's various powers sympathized with Dawn Dominance despite themselves. Previously, Dawn Dominance's bid to increase world domination's influence in the Dark World through this war had exasperated the various powers present. This was especially true for Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society. Currently, however, both Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold only felt pity for Dawn Dominance. After all, Shifeng was truly too vicious. By deliberately repeating his question, not only did Shifeng thoroughly humiliate Dawn Dominance, but Dawn Dominance also had no choice but to stomach this humiliation in silence. Guild Leader Dawn, if you wish to continue fighting, I won't object. Only, the outcome will not be within my control. Shifeng said and shrugged as he looked at Dawn Dominance's enraged expression, indicating that he had no qualms whatsoever. Upon hearing Shifeng's words, the upper echelons of the Dark World's various guilds and adventurer teams immediately grew nervous, and they all sent meaningful looks at Dawn Dominance. The Zero Wing members and various superpowers spectating experts present gaped in shock at this sight. The Dark World that had once stricken fear into the main continent's various superpowers was now timorous after a few words from Shifeng. If they were to retell today's tale, nobody would believe them. However, it had happened right before their very eyes. Of course, the various superpowers experts could sympathize with the Dark World's players. The current battle involved the foundations of both sides. If the Dark Army perished, then the Dark World's various powers would lose all the fruits of their efforts, with nothing to show for it. This definitely wasn't an outcome they could accept. Guild Leader Black Flame, I admit that you are very powerful. The Dark World will give up on this teleportation gate. However, don't think you can feel pleased for long. You won't be able to defend this teleportation gate forever. Dawn Dominance said after taking in a deep breath. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. As soon as Dawn Dominance finished speaking, he turned around and walked back to the teleportation gate. He had no intention of staying in Cold Spring Forest for even a moment longer. Upon seeing this, the members of the Dark World's powers promptly withdrew to the Dark World as well. None of them chose to remain in Cold Spring Forest. Only a few independent players decided to stay behind and take a look at the situation. Zero Wing won just like that. Purple Rakshasa was stunned when she saw the Dark World's various powers retreating. For a moment, she felt as if she was dreaming. Against an entire world's experts, Zero Wing had actually emerged victorious. Chapter 2569. Gathering for Nothing? Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City. As news of the Dark World's teleportation gates opening had already spread across the entire Cold Spring Forest, the tension in Stone Forest City had increased, and many of the city's resident players had decided to leave and develop somewhere else. This development left the once bustling city quiet. Stone Forest City's previously crowded Main Street now had less than half the players it originally did. Moreover, it was only because of the newly established Freedom Hotel that this many players chose to remain in the city. However, the majority of these players were actually experts belonging to the various major powers. Very few were independent players. At this time, a group of cloaked players entered the Freedom Hotel's first-floor lobby, the appearance of these players triggering loud discussions among the other players there. The reason for the strong reaction was the secret pavilion's experts guiding this group of nearly 100 cloaked players. Standing at the head of the secret pavilion's experts were the well-known Yuan Tiexin, and a male half-elf who looked to be in his 40s. Amazing! Who are those people? They're actually being guided by an elder of the secret pavilion. Those people must be big shots of superpowers. I recall that the secret pavilion is a shareholder of Stone Forest City. Now that the Dark World's players have entered Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City faces a very bleak future. Those cloaked people might be reinforcements the secret pavilion recruited. Reinforcements? What's the point of calling in reinforcements? That's an entire world we're talking about. That's not something any individual superpower can go up against. Even multiple superpowers working together won't be able to stop the Dark World's invasion. The various major powers experts in the lobby were eaten up with curiosity as they discussed the identities of the cloaked experts. Nowadays, Stone Forest City was already a holy land for players who wanted to develop themselves. After all, the city boasted not only an incredibly high mana density, but also the Freedom Hotel, which greatly amplified the rate at which players accumulated the double EXP buff. It was even rumored that the Freedom Hotel's top-floor rooms could accelerate the removal of foreign energy from one's body and increase the efficiency of one's training in combat techniques. In the current era, where combat techniques had become more commonly available in God's domain, the Freedom Hotel's functions held a fatal temptation to expert players. If a power could develop their expert players using the Freedom Hotel's functions over long periods, the development speed of said power would reach unimaginable heights. Since the secret pavilion was one of Stone Forest City's shareholders, the guild naturally wouldn't give up on the city without a fight. Only, now that the Dark World's teleportation gate was open, the various major powers experts found it inconceivable that any power could stop the Dark World's players. Please wait a moment. I'll go rent an advanced reception room, Yuan Tiexin said to the cloaked players behind him. He went up to the front desk and presented a gold card to the receptionist there. And upon seeing the card, the various major powers' upper echelons were green with envy. The Freedom Hotel's gold membership card. Due to the Freedom Hotel's amazing functions, the various major powers all sought membership in the Freedom Hotel, the higher the better. However, doing so was incredibly difficult. Even now, those major powers had managed to gain only a bronze membership. If they wished to elevate their membership status to silver, they would need to accumulate a large number of contribution points in the Freedom Hotel, which could be acquired only by selling rare materials and doing quests. Moreover, each player could sell only a limited amount of materials per day. Meanwhile, a gold membership allowed players to rent the rooms on the Freedom Hotel's top floor. While Yuan Tiexin was handling the rental procedures, the cloaked players standing behind him studied the Freedom Hotel's interior. So this is Zero Wing's Freedom Hotel? This place really is amazing, said a cloaked, male youth radiating dense darkness energy. He sighed ruefully when he sensed the density of the mana inside the hotel and the mana's effects. It's no wonder Zero Wing dared to offend our guild before. So what if Zero Wing dared to offend us? In the end, Zero Wing still lost to Vice Guild leader Light. A level 109 elementalist standing beside the male youth and similarly radiating darkness energy said disdainfully. This time, the secret pavilion had not only taken the initiative to invite the various superpowers that Demon's Heart had secretly partnered up with, but also extended an invitation to Demon's Heart. One could easily imagine the direness of Zero Wing's current situation. Unfortunately, even if the secret pavilion stepped forward this time, it couldn't do much to change the outcome of this war, as the various superpowers present were hellbent on obtaining Stone Forest City. As the two experts from Demon's Heart quietly conversed with each other, Illusory Words, who similarly stood among the cloaked players, wore a frown on her face. Illusory, it seems the chances of Zero Wing surviving are slim. So many superpowers have actually gathered to obtain Stone Forest City. I doubt even the secret pavilion expected such a development. The fierce man standing beside Illusory Words said, sighing. The secret pavilion had invited all the superpowers targeting Stone Forest City to the negotiations. Crimson Emperor had estimated that 6 or 7 superpowers, at most, had their eye on Stone Forest City. However, the actual number turned out to be more than 10. Even Battle Wolves, which had an irreconcilable feud with Demon's Heart, had decided to join in the fray. If these superpowers banded together, they would have a minimum of 4,000 Tier 3 experts with very high combat standards. If they worked together with the Dark World's forces and attacked Stone Forest City from both the inside and outside, Stone Forest City wouldn't stand a chance. Of course, the fierce man could also understand why the various superpowers were willing to go to such lengths to obtain Stone Forest City. After all, the advantages the city brought were simply amazing. This was especially true for the Freedom Hotel. No superpower would pass up the Freedom Hotel's benefits. Moreover, Zero Wing had even taken the initiative to meet the Dark World's army at the teleportation gate. That was simply suicide. Now, even if all of the 5 great super guilds banded together, they still wouldn't be able to save Zero Wing. At this moment, let alone Illusory Words and the fierce man from Crimson Emperor, even Yuan Tiexin, who had invited the various superpowers secretly targeting Stone Forest City, was surprised by this situation. He never thought that there would be more than 10 superpowers targeting Stone Forest City this time. Aside from Demon's Heart and Starlink, which bore deep hatred for Zero Wing, the superpowers included the Ten Saints Empire's Demon Palace, the Shadow World's Shadowless Empire, and the Super Guilds Battle Wolves and Pantheon. Not to mention Mythology, one of the 5 great super guilds, which wasn't present among the superpowers he invited, was sure to be taking action in secret against Stone Forest City as well. If all these superpowers worked together, they could shake the entire eastern continent. What more a measly Stone Forest City? For a moment, Yuan Tiexin could not help but doubt if the negotiations this time would truly yield any results. Ha ha! Zero Wing is doomed now. Troubled Times, who had come with flaming light, could not help but grow ecstatic as he took in the various superpowers representatives around him. With so many superpowers gathered here, even a super guild won't be able to stop the upcoming assault. Previously, when Shifeng had publicly executed Troubled Times in Demon City, not only did Troubled Times' strength diminish greatly, but his reputation in the Dark Den had also fallen into ruin. Originally, Troubled Times thought that he wouldn't have an opportunity to get revenge on Zero Wing. However, his chance had come so quickly. Everyone, the reception room is ready. Please follow me, Yuan Tiexin said to the cloaked group behind him. However, just as Yuan Tiexin was about to lead the group to the Freedom Hotel's top-floor reception room, a figure suddenly appeared before him. The other players present in the lobby gaped in shock at the development. The players the secret pavilion invited might be hiding their identities, but they had not done anything to conceal their auras, and their auras made it clear that every one of these people was a peak expert or above. Anyone that dared to stand in their path had to be tired of living. However, someone actually dared to do so. Moreover, this person was a woman wearing Zero Wing's emblem, and her level was only a pitiful 100. Miss Melancholic, do you have business with us? Yuan Tiexin asked in confusion. He had recognized this woman immediately. This woman was none other than Melancholic Smile, the manager of Zero Wing's candlelight trading firm, as well as one of the Freedom Hotel's managers. Yuan Tiexin had not intentionally tried to conceal the fact that he had invited the various superpowers for negotiations. And in his opinion, Zero Wing should have no reason whatsoever to stop him from doing so. After all, the secret pavilion was one of Stone Forest City's shareholders, and negotiating with the various superpowers could reduce the number of enemies Zero Wing would have to face. Now, however, Melancholic Smile had suddenly appeared before their group. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. It's nothing important, Melancholic Smile said, shaking her head. I'm just following the guild leader's instructions to relay a message to these people. Relay a message? Is he taking the initiative to hand over Stone Forest City's shares now that he knows he can't win? Troubled Times asked, laughing in ridicule. Upon hearing Troubled Times' words, the various superpowers experts present also started laughing. With things having reached this point already, wasn't it a little too late for regrets? Our guild leader has stated that if you wish to develop in Stone Forest City with peace in mind, then Zero Wing will welcome you with open arms. However, if you wish to meddle in Stone Forest City's affairs, you'd best return to wherever you came from instead of asking for trouble. Melancholic Smile declared calmly as she swept her gaze across the players before her. Chapter 2570. On the verge of war, Crazy Zero Wing. At first, the players in the lobby had paid close attention to the mysterious group Yuan Tiexin had invited, and Melancholic Smile hadn't tried to keep her voice down. Hence, after her declaration, silence had fallen in the hotel lobby as everyone stared at her in astonishment. What's going on? Those people must be big shots from the various superpowers, yet she dares to speak to them like that? Amazing. Truly amazing. Even now Zero Wing still behaves so haughtily. Since the day I joined God's domain, I've never seen such a suicidal guild. None of these players were fools, and even though they hid themselves under black cloaks, the individuals Yuan Tiexin had invited were clearly from the various superpowers. Moreover, they should be the superpowers' top-ranked experts based on their auras. Now that the Dark World's teleportation gate was active, it would only be a matter of time before dark players flooded into Cold Spring Forest. The entire level 100 neutral map was in danger, as was Stone Forest City. Yet, even in such a dire predicament, Zero Wing continued to maintain its arrogance before the various superpowers. This was just insane. Miss Melancholic, what are you? Yuan Tiexin was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe what was happening. If he hadn't been certain that Melancholic Smile wasn't some spy and an actual core member in Zero Wing, who had worked her way up the ranks, he would have suspected otherwise. Her announcement was practically a dare to the various superpowers, and would undoubtedly lead to Zero Wing's elimination from Cold Spring Forest. What are Zero Wing's intentions, old Yuan? Scorching Shine asked from beside Yuan Tiexin with a frosty look. He had already surmised that the chances of their plan succeeding were very low. Stone Forest City's Freedom Hotel was too tempting to give up, after all. However, it was also the reason that the secret pavilion didn't want other superpowers to stick their fingers in the city. Unfortunately, Melancholic Smile's statement had as good as ruined their plan. No one would be surprised if the various superpowers shed all pretenses with Zero Wing immediately, let alone negotiate. For a moment, Yuan Tiexin was speechless. Cold Spring Forest was a lost cause at this point. Even the various superpowers would have a hard time developing in the area, much less Zero Wing. There was simply no way Zero Wing could retain absolute control over Stone Forest City. It'd be a miracle if the guild even kept a portion of the city. Yuan Tiexin had worked with Shifeng many times before, so he knew the swordsman was open to persuasion, not coercion. If he insisted that Shifeng gave away a significant portion of the city's shares, their discussion would end on a sour note. Knowing this, he hadn't bothered to contact Shifeng before his negotiation with the various superpowers. He would only try to convince Shifeng once the negotiations had reached a satisfying conclusion. With things as they were now, Zero Wing would have to sacrifice some of Stone Forest City's shares if it wished to survive. Maintaining full control was impossible. But Yuan Tiexin had never considered that Shifeng would be ruthless enough to send Melancholic Smile, to disrespect the various superpowers so blatantly. He had definitely gone insane this time. Ha ha. Interesting. Zero Wing is truly fascinating. Even now, it displays such confidence. It's no wonder why it dares to offend so many superpowers. It seems my visit to Stone Forest City wasn't a waste. An elderly crimson-eyed man wearing the Shadowless Empire's emblem and holding a scarlet staff said, laughing. Old Lu, do you think Zero Wing is just putting on a brave face? Evil Qilin, who wore Demon Palace's emblem and carried a war axe that radiated strange energy, asked, sneering at the crimson-browed elder. Zero Wing is digging its own grave by provoking us. I think you still have a grudge over losing to Black Flame Qilin. The crimson-eyed elder shot back, chuckling at the glare Evil Qilin directed his way. Instead of rising to the crimson-eyed elder's teasing, Evil Qilin simply smiled as he said, the situation on Dragonheart Island is one thing, but we're in Cold Spring Forest. Moreover, this won't be some small team battle in the fields. We're talking about a conflict with an entire otherworld. Zero Wing hasn't tried to win us over, but has sent some nobody to spit in our faces. If that isn't stupidity, what is? Demon Palace's other members nodded in agreement. Due to Zero Wing, Demon Palace's reputation on Dragonheart Island had suffered, but this situation was completely different. More than 10 superpowers had gathered in Stone Forest City. Even without including the Dark Worlds players, there were more than enough hostile players to end Zero Wing's reign. Instead of negotiating for peace, Zero Wing has sent someone to slap the gathered superpowers in the face. The guild must be giving up. After a brief moment of silence, Troubled Time's smile grew into a grin. He then walked up to Melancholic Smile without any hesitation. Lady from Zero Wing, we're here precisely to cause trouble. What are you going to do about it? Troubled Times asked, raising his voice deliberately to ensure that every player in the lobby heard him. Hearing Troubled Time's threat, an uproar shook the lobby. What? Are the various superpowers really going to fight Zero Wing? Zero Wing asked for it. We may be in Stone Forest City, but do you think the various superpowers would let such intentional disrespect slide? Zero Wing truly is doomed now. Now, not only does it have to deal with the Dark World's invasion, but it will also have to face the various superpowers' wrath. The experts that recently joined Zero Wing must deeply regret their decisions. The various major powers members started chatting amongst themselves as they watched the tense conversation play out. They could hardly believe Zero Wing's behavior. None of them had expected the guild to shed all pretenses before the various superpowers representatives. While everyone expected Melancholic Smile to panic, however, she smiled brightly at Troubled Times and replied, if that's the case, Zero Wing will have no choice but to erase you from Cold Spring Forest. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. You again. The lobby fell deathly silent. Melancholic Smile's response even stunned Troubled Times. He couldn't understand why she was so bold. Wasn't she supposed to grovel at his feet and beg for mercy? It seems your instincts were wrong this time, Illusory. That girl is just as insane as her guild leader. She's only pushing Zero Wing further down the path of no return. The fierce man from Crimson Emperor said, admiring Melancholic Smile's bravery. Every one of the various superpowers representatives wanted to declare war on Zero Wing that moment. They hadn't found a good excuse to attack Stone Forest City yet, but Zero Wing had just given them the reason they had been searching for. The fierce man looked over, expecting to see Illusory words bitter after misjudging Zero Wing, but he saw that she maintained a neutral expression, focused on a message she had just received. After a moment, she looked up and took a deep breath before informing her companion. My instincts might have been wrong, but her statement isn't. Chapter 2571. Astonished once more. Hotel in an uproar. What do you mean? Illusory Word's statement confused her fierce comrade from Crimson Emperor. What did she mean by her instincts had been wrong, but Melancholic Smile wasn't? The current situation was clear for all to see, and Illusory Words had acknowledged that she had misjudged Zero Wing. How could Melancholic Smile's statement possibly be correct? Zero Wing was struggling to survive. Chasing the various superpowers out of Cold Spring Forest from such a position was a joke. To be precise, my instincts were only partially correct. Illusory Words explained, chuckling at the fierce man's confused look. It's best if you take a look for yourself. I just received this message from Graceful Monarch. Graceful Monarch? Has something unexpected happened at the teleportation gate? Curious, the fierce man opened the message Illusory Words had forwarded. Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa had wanted to see the Dark World's teleportation gate themselves and get a clear grasp of the invading army's strength. Zero Wing had also dispatched quite a few players to the gate, and by allowing the two Dark Den players to spectate, they'd find out exactly what Zero Wing intended. In his opinion, Zero Wing was wasting its time in trying to negotiate with the Dark World's various powers, especially once they'd seen the benefits Cold Spring Forest and Stone Forest City had to offer. Regardless of what the guild tried to offer, the outcome wouldn't change. Retaining a small fraction of the city's shares was the best Zero Wing could hope for. It shouldn't dream of holding more power than that. The Dark World's invading army had more than 30,000 Tier 3 experts. No individual power would have the strength to stand up against that. While the fierce man carefully read Graceful Monarch's message, more players had begun to gather in the Freedom Hotel. A large number of independent experts had come to hear what Melancholic Smile had to say. Did she get the wrong message? Dropping all pretense with the various superpowers would only bring Zero Wing more harm. Stone Forest City might not even last 3 days at this rate, much less a week. Galaxy Past, who had just arrived in the Freedom Hotel's lobby, gaped in shock when he heard about Melancholic Smile's interaction with the superpowers representatives. Every player in the city was paying attention to the current situation Zero Wing and Cold Spring Forest faced. Although word of the various superpowers moving against Stone Forest City had long since reached the masses, Galaxy Pass still had a hard time believing that Zero Wing would take the initiative to offend the various superpowers. He too knew that Zero Wing would never bend to coercion, only persuasion. He also knew that the guild was insane and acted no differently than a gambling addict. Or maybe the guild has a secret relationship with battle wolves, so they've decided to give up on this struggle? Sirius's interruption stunned the players in the lobby. No one had thought that battle wolves, a super guild, would forsake the contest for Stone Forest City. Battle wolves, huh? Even Yuan Tiexin was slightly surprised by Sirius's admission, yet he could understand the reason behind it. Battle wolves and Demon's Heart had an irreconcilable feud. Since Demon's Heart was moving against Zero Wing, it was only natural that battle wolves would interfere. Stepping forward to side with Zero Wing was well within reason. On the other hand, Troubled Times and his Demon's Heart companions were particularly surprised to hear Sirius's declaration. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, after all. As Troubled Times and the others assumed the minor interlude had concluded, another player spoke up from among the crowd. Greetings, Miss Melancholic. Crimson Emperor is here to negotiate with Zero Wing as well. That is our only intention. Those who have spoken out against your guild only represent certain powers. They have no bearing on Crimson Emperor's will. Illusory Words announced as she stepped forward. For a moment, everyone in the lobby fell silent. What's going on? Crimson Emperor stands by Zero Wing's side too? Not only had Battle Wolves declared its intentions to ally with Zero Wing, but Crimson Emperor had as well. Everyone's eyes nearly fell out of their sockets. Has Crimson Emperor gone mad? Troubled Times stared at Illusory Words and her entourage in confusion. While he could understand Battle Wolf's decision, he couldn't even fathom what drove Crimson Emperor. Crimson Emperor was neither a friend of Zero Wing's nor Demon's Heart's enemy, yet it was showing strong support for the former. The situation was baffling. Of course, while the two guilds allying themselves with Zero Wing was unexpected, it wouldn't affect the overall situation. Before anyone could overcome their surprise, however, several more players spoke up from among the cloaked group. Shadowless Empire also wishes to form a partnership. We have only come here with this group due to Old Yuan's invitation. Young lady from Zero Wing, please, do not misinterpret our intentions, the crimson-eyed elder from Shadowless Empire declared, stepping away from the group. You really are a sleaze, old Lu. You make it sound as if Demon Palace has some other reason for being here. Evil Qilin said, similarly removing himself from the group as he rolled his eyes at the crimson-eyed elder. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. After the representatives from Shadowless Empire and Demon Palace declared their desire for peace, the other representatives, aside from those from Demon's Heart and Starlink, did the same, insisting to Melancholic Smile that they were only there to seek an alliance with her guild, nothing else. The various major powers members and independent players in the Freedom Hotel's lobby were dumbfounded as they watched the scene play out. What's going on? What has Zero Wing done? Even Yuan Tiexin and Troubled Times watched with their jaws hanging open. They had no idea what was happening either. Chapter 2572, Stone Forest City Shaken. Darkness disappears. The situation even confused Melancholic Smile, to say nothing of Yuan Tiexin and Troubled Times. Only a moment ago, these superpowers representatives had been silent, but based on their imposing auras, they had harbored no intentions of allying with Zero Wing. Now they displayed a completely different attitude. Before Troubled Times could say anything to these representatives, a hand shot out and stopped him. His mouth clicked shut as he glanced at Flaming Light in confusion. "We're leaving." Flaming Light snapped after one last glance at Melancholic Smile. He turned and left the Freedom Hotel without another word. He made no attempts to win back the various superpowers. "Are we just going to let Zero Wing off the hook, Vice Guild Leader?" Troubled Times whispered to Flaming Light. They had gone to great lengths to gather so many superpowers. Combined with the Dark World's forces, Stone Forest City, even at intermediate rank, was a fish on the cutting board. Most of the superpowers they had gathered may have abandoned the plan to attack Stone Forest City, but they could still cause enough trouble to cost Zero Wing a fortune and accelerate the city's downfall with Starlink, Demon's Heart, and the adventurer team's mythology controlled, even if they couldn't deal a severe blow. Fool. Do you think those superpowers would suddenly change their minds without a reason? Flaming Light growled as he glared at Troubled Times. Have they unearthed some sort of unexpected information? Troubled Times wondered, realization dawning on him. Those superpowers are all sly foxes. No ordinary news could make them change sides so drastically. Something big must have happened with the Dark World, Flaming Light hissed. Something's happened to the Dark World? How is that possible? Troubled Times could not help his skepticism. The Dark World was home to powerful lunatics, where the strong preyed upon the weak. If the Dark World's players wanted to enter Cold Spring Forest, there was no power strong enough to stop them, not even Flaming Light, who was responsible for opening the teleportation gate. I'm not sure yet. I could be overthinking things, Flaming Light said, shaking his head. In reality, he found the deduction hard to believe. We need to send someone to investigate immediately. I'll contact Elder Heart right away, Troubled Times said, nodding. Even after Flaming Light and his entourage left the Freedom Hotel, the lobby was still silent as the various major powers members and independent players remained speechless. Everything had changed too suddenly. A second ago, the various superpowers had been ready to draw their weapons and declare war on Zero Wing, but in the next moment, they voiced their intentions to ally with the guild. The crowd even wondered if those cloaked players were truly upper echelons from the various superpowers or not. What's going on here, Old Yuan? Why are these superpowers behaving like this? Scorching Shine asked, unable to hold back his curiosity any longer. At this moment, Yuan Tiexin was just as confused. He too wished to know what had just changed. Yuan Tiexin struggled to find an answer for Scorched Shine's question when he noticed that he had received a message from Purple Jade some time ago. Could Zero Wing have done something? Realization dawned on Yuan Tiexin when he saw the message. When he had heard that Zero Wing had rashly sent a force to the Dark World's teleportation gate, he had sent Purple Jade to investigate the situation. Since she had messaged him, he found it likely that Zero Wing had done something at the gate, which had in turn caused this unexpected development. The other superpowers representatives must also have received news, which had changed their minds. Even if Zero Wing has done something, this outcome shouldn't be possible. Yuan Tiexin felt that something was amiss, and he immediately opened Purple Jade's message. By the time he finished reading her report, he was astounded. "Old Yuan, what's happened? Did you get disconnected?" Scorching Shine asked when he saw his old comrade's slack expression. Not even Scorching Shine's question shook Yuan Tiexin from his daze. He only opened his mouth after some time and stuttered. "TV won. Zero Wing actually won." "Zero Wing won? What did it win?" Scorching Shine prodded. "Zero Wing won the Dark World." After taking in a deep breath, Yuan Tiexin clearly explained, "Zero Wing just won the Dark World at the teleportation gate." Won the Dark World? Yuan Tiexin's abnormal behavior baffled Scorching Shine. The man was, after all, utterly incoherent. Did he have Alzheimer's? For a moment, Scorching Shine thought it might be time to suggest to his guild leader that Yuan Tiexin take a vacation. "Brother Shine, I apologize. I got too excited." Yuan Tiexin apologized when he realized that Scorching Shine was looking at him like a mental patient. Chuckling, he explained, "A few minutes ago, Zero Wing led a legion of Tier 3 NPCs and repelled the Dark World's invading army. Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader and the Dark World's representative, has publicly announced their retreat. Zero Wing has taken full control of the Dark World's teleportation gate." "Zero Wing has defeated the Dark World's invading army? Are you toying with me, old Yuan?" Scorching Shine questioned, giving Yuan Tiexin a disdainful look. Since Yuan Tiexin hadn't controlled his voice, everyone in the lobby had heard him clearly. A commotion erupted, and the various major powers experts and independent players stared at Yuan Tiexin, as if he were a blubbering fool. No individual power in God's domain was capable of standing against the Dark World's invading army. Although Zero Wing had a large number of Tier 3 NPCs under its command, that only amounted to 600. Trying to stop more than 30,000 Tier 3 players with a measly 600 Tier 3 NPCs was a joke. Even if they included every Tier 3 player in Zero Wing, the guild should have no hope of stopping the Dark World's invading army. Furthermore, the various powers that called the Dark World home had extraordinary powers. If they all revealed just one of their many trump cards, they could easily annihilate every player in Cold Spring Forest 10 times over. With such strength, how could Zero Wing possibly defeat this invading army? "I knew you wouldn't believe me. Here, take a look. This is the battle video Jade recorded," Yuan Tiexin said, shaking his head helplessly. Yuan Tiexin found the situation just as unbelievable, but with the facts before him, he had no choice but to recognize it as truth. Scorching Shine then watched the video Yuan Tiexin sent him. Silence. Shock. How is this possible? Scorching Shine couldn't believe his eyes. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. They were talking about several million expert players. He also saw several dozen Tier 4 summon creatures and several thousand Tier 3 personal guards. Yet, even with such power, the Dark World's invading army had suffered defeat. Shortly after the video ended, a group of players entered the Freedom Hotel's lobby in a hurry, clearly excited. "Big news, everyone. Great news. Zero Wings just repelled the Dark World's invading army and has taken control of the Dark World's teleportation gate." Chapter 2573. Popular Stone Forest City. When the group that had just burst into the Freedom Hotel excitedly announced Zero Wing's victory of the Dark World's invading army, the players in the lobby, who had been skeptical about Yuan Tiexin's stunned announcement, were flabbergasted. "What? It's actually true? How could Zero Wing have possibly won? We're talking about an entire world of experts." The fact that the secret pavilion held some of Stone Forest City's shares was no longer a secret. Thus, there had been a chance that Yuan Tiexin had been lying to boost Zero Wing's reputation. The players that had just arrived, however, were a different story. Every member of the group was an independent player, and a few of them were well known among the adventurer teams unrelated to Zero Wing in the city. Because of this, they were considered quite credible. Most importantly, they had just explained the sudden change in the various superpowers' attitudes regarding Zero Wing. Even with many players still doubting the news, assuming it was either a lie or outrageously exaggerated, There was no doubt that the guild in question had done something to change the superpowers' minds. That fact alone was enough to shock everyone in the lobby only moments before they were overcome with joy. Without the various superpowers' interference, and with Stone Forest City's defenses and terrain advantage, even the Dark Worlds players would need a long time before they could capture the city. Meanwhile, resident players like themselves could safely and far faster than those based outside of Stone Forest City. Thankfully, we weren't too rash, but I really doubt that Zero Wing's foundations are this formidable. Demon's Heart's flaming light must be going mad with regret right about now. The fierce man from Crimson Emperor said with a bitter smile. The main reason that the various superpowers were so afraid of Demon's Heart was the key in Flaming Light's possession, which allowed him to open the Dark World's teleportation gate in any location he desired. If not for this trump card, Demon's Heart wouldn't have developed so smoothly in the Ten Saints Empire. Flaming Light had intended to use this trump card to salvage Demon's Heart's reputation and deter the Ten Saints Empire's various superpowers, but now both his threat and plans had gone to the dogs. In fact, Flaming Light's trump card had unexpectedly benefited Zero Wing, increasing both the guild's fame and fortune. It was only a matter of time before word of the Dark World's defeat spread across the main continent, and as it did, everyone would learn about Zero Wing. Not even the various superpowers were capable of accomplishing such a feat. Yet Zero Wing had succeeded, although the guild had relied on a large number of Tier 3 NPCs to do so. Those NPCs were considered a part of Zero Wing's strength. In addition, with the Dark World's teleportation gate under Zero Wing's control, even ordinary players knew this victory would usher in an era of power for the guild. No one would be surprised if it instantly became a superpower in its own right. And the one who granted Zero Wing this opportunity was none other than Demon's Heart's Flaming Light. That's right. Without the Dark World's assistance, Demon's Heart will have a very hard time expanding in the Ten Saints Empire. Illusory Words agreed, nodding. Demon's Heart had gone out for wool and come home shorn. The Dark World's teleportation gate should have triggered unprecedented change on the main continent. However, Zero Wing now controlled the gate, and the guild had made it clear that it intended to collect a fee from every player that wanted to use the teleportation gate. This would significantly decrease the number of visiting Dark World players and, in turn, reduce the number of Demon's Heart's potential allies. Unless the Dark Guild wanted to face the Ten Saints Empire's various superpowers, it would have to keep a low profile for a considerable amount of time. You've done a great job this time, Illusory. Since the Grand Elders had nearly made such a catastrophic mistake, the guild leader has reclaimed a lot of authority in the guild. The guild leader sent a message ago requesting that you represent Crimson Emperor in the negotiations with Zero Wing. It would also be best if you could rent a few of the Freedom Hotel's rooms long-term. Don't worry about the required money and materials. The fierce man congratulated his comrade. The guild leader's requests are certainly troublesome. Now that Zero Wing has defeated the Dark World, a ton of powers will try to rent a large number of the hotel rooms. Illusory Words grumbled, offering a half-hearted smile. With Cold Spring Forest now free of the Dark World's threat, Stone Forest City was, once again, a sacred leveling ground. It would soon become a holy city for the Eastern Continent's various powers and independent players, and when it did, even entering the city would become a challenge, let alone renting one of the Freedom Hotel's rooms. Shortly after the various superpowers meeting in the first-floor lobby had concluded, news of the Dark World's defeat spread throughout the continent. As they learned of the event, many powers began to regret their decision to abandon Stone Forest City the moment things had turned south. Crap. How is this even possible? Zero Wing is so awesome. Even an entire otherworld of players is helpless against that guild. Who could possibly stand against it? Stone Forest City? It seems like a good place to develop. When the various kingdoms and empires' powers and independent experts learned about Zero Wing's victory, many of them considered moving their bases of operations to Stone Forest City. Aside from the fact that Stone Forest City occupied a level 100 neutral map, the fact that the Dark World's invading army hadn't been able to shake Zero Wing's foundations made the city incredibly valuable. None of the city's residents would have to worry about suddenly losing their bases or another power taking over. which would render all of their investments useless. This concern was precisely the reason that many players developed in NPC cities, rather than in guild cities. Now that Zero Wing had affirmed its strength, Stone Forest City's stability wasn't a concern. At the very least, it would be a long while before any power could bring harm to the city. This time period would be more than enough for players to earn back what they had invested in the city. For a time, players from various kingdoms and empires swarmed toward Stone Forest City. The abrupt population boom was easily 10 times larger than the initial wave of players that visited the city once it had reached intermediate rank. Moreover, an astounding number of players had begun to apply to the guild. Zero Wing had already received more than 2 million applicants among its various branches, with many of these experts capable of reaching the trial tower's 5th floor and beyond. Gentle Snow, Aqua Rose, and Zero Wing's other management personnel were stupefied. No matter how well they had managed Zero Wing in the past, few new experts had applied to join. Yet after a single battle, everything had changed. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Guild Leader, Stone Forest City's player population has exceeded 8 million. And I believe even more players are on their way. Should we slightly raise the city's entrance fee? Aqua Rose asked, still blissful after reading the latest statistics report. Their war with the Dark World had ended less than half a day ago. Yet Stone Forest City's player population had risen from less than 2 million to over 8 million. The number of players visiting the city had completely exceeded her expectations. No, let's forget about increasing the entrance fee. We still need a large number of independent players to settle down in Stone Forest City. However, we can increase the Freedom Hotel's prices. Don't normal rooms cost 30 silver per day? Raise it to 1 gold. Bronze members will get a 10% discount, silver members will get 20%, and gold members will get 30%. Shifeng decided, chuckling. Nothing in this world came for free. Since the various powers wanted their experts to develop as quickly as possible, he wouldn't be courteous. He was incredibly poor right now after all. To arm his night division, he had spent almost all of the money he had. I understand. The pricing astonished Aqua Rose a little. Not even ordinary experts could afford a daily expense of 1 gold. Alright. Guild Leader, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society have contacted me and wish to discuss the offer you made them. They're asking when you'll be free to speak on the matter. You're tuning in to the Lime's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.